In 63 BC, a Roman army broke into Jerusalem, and the Republic declared Judea conquered. It was wrong. Rome would have to conquer this land again in 37 BC, again in 70 AD, and again in 135. No other province demanded this. Look at the Eastern Mediterranean in the autumn of 63 BC. Rome has spent a generation in the east, and the map shows it. Pontus is broken. The kingdom of Tigranes has knelt. The Seleucid Empire, which once ruled from the Aegean coast to the borders of India, has been quietly abolished by a single Roman commander who decided it was no longer worth preserving. That commander is Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, and he is wintering at Damascus. From Damascus, the road runs south. Follow it. It drops through Coele, Syria between the two Lebanon ranges, crosses the shoulder of the anti-Lebanon, and falls into the great rift of the Jordan Valley. A trench so deep that the river running along its floor lies below the level of the sea, past the fortress of Alexandrium, perched on a cone of rock above the valley. Down through Jericho in its groves of date palms and balsam. Then west and up, climbing out of the rift into the Judean hills. Name the country as it passes. The Jordan running south into the Dead Sea. The Judean desert falling away to the east in white ridges of chalk. The coastal plain to the west with its old Philistine cities. Galilee in the north, green and crowded with villages. Idumea in the south, dry and only recently conquered by its neighbors. And at the center, on a plateau cut off on two sides by ravines, a walled city built around a temple platform. Rome has been in the east for a generation. It has never ruled this land. That is about to change. And then it is going to keep changing, over and over, for 200 years. This is the story of 4 Roman conquests of the same country. Pompey in 63 BC, Herod in 37, Titus in 70 AD, Hadrian's generals in 135. Along the way, the ambush at Beth Horon, the Siege of Jotapata, a battle fought on the Sea of Galilee, the fortress of Gamla, the burning of the temple, Masada and Betar, and at the end, the strangest question. Why did Rome erase this province from the map? Before the First Legion marches, do 3 things for me. Hit the like button, get hyped in the comments, because this one runs long and it runs dark. And subscribe so that more history at this length keeps finding you. Then answer me this. If you had to hold out against Rome, what would you trust? Walls, mountains, or the desert? Give me your answer below and defend it, because before this video ends you are going to watch all 3 of them fail. So why did Rome invade Judea in the first place? The short answer is that Judea invited it. For about 80 years, the country had been independent, and that independence was itself a war story. A priestly family from the village of Modian had risen against the Seleucid king Antiochus IV, beaten a professional Hellenistic army in the hills, cleansed a desecrated temple, and then, generation by generation, turned a rebellion into a kingdom. These were the Hasmoneans. By the reign of Alexander Jannaeus, they ruled the coast, the Galilee, the Jordan crossings, and Idumea in the south, whose people they had conquered and forcibly circumcised, absorbing them into the nation. It was the largest Jewish state since the age of the kings, and it was built on the memory of resisting a foreign empire. Then, it ate itself. When Queen Salome Alexandra died in 67 BC, she left 2 sons. The elder was Hyrcanus II, the high priest, a mild and cautious man whom almost every ancient writer describes as pliable. The younger was Aristobulus II, energetic, ambitious, popular with the soldiers, and entirely unwilling to stand second. Aristobulus took the field, bought the army, and forced his brother into retirement within months. It should have ended there. It did not end there, because of one man standing behind the loser. His name was Antipater, and he was an Idumean. His family were among those southerners absorbed into the nation 2 generations earlier, which meant that in the eyes of Jerusalem's aristocracy, he was a Jew by conquest rather than by descent. And they never let him forget it. He was also the most capable political operator in the country. Antipater understood something that the Hasmonean princes did not. The future of Judea was no longer going to be decided in Judea. It was going to be decided by whichever Roman happened to be standing nearest with an army. Remember Antipater. His son is going to be the second Roman conquest of this country. Antipater persuaded Hyrcanus to run to the Nabatean king Aretas at Petra, promising him border towns in exchange for an army. Aretas came, beat Aristobulus in the field, and besieged him on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. And it is here, during that siege, that you get the first sign of what this land is going to do to the political imagination of everyone who touches it. The besiegers, needing animals for the daily sacrifice, agreed to sell them to the besieged over the wall for a high price. The besieged sent up the money. The besiegers took the money and sent up pigs instead. Ancient tradition adds an earthquake as divine comment. Whatever you make of the story, both sides understood exactly what the temple was worth as a weapon. Into that siege walked Rome. Pompey was reorganizing the east and had sent his lieutenant Marcus Aemilius Scaurus ahead into Syria. Scaurus arrived at Jerusalem in 65 BC, listened to both brothers, and accepted an enormous bribe from Aristobulus, who could pay more. Scaurus ordered Aretas to withdraw, which Aretas did, and Aristobulus chased the retreating Nabateans and beat them on the way home. So, the first Roman intervention in Judean affairs was a purchased verdict, and it worked out for the buyer. That lesson stuck, and it was the wrong lesson. 2 years later, Pompey himself came south to Damascus, and both brothers came to plead their case in person. So did a third delegation. This detail matters more than anything else in the act. Josephus records that alongside Hyrcanus and Aristobulus, there arrived a deputation representing the nation itself. And their petition was not that Rome should choose one prince. It was that Rome should abolish the monarchy altogether and let the country be governed as it had been before the Hasmoneans crowned themselves by its priests under its law. They were not asking for a king. They were asking to be left alone with their God. Hold that thought for 2 centuries, because it is the whole story in one sentence. Rome will spend 200 years trying to find the right ruler for Judea. And a substantial part of Judea will spend 200 years explaining that the problem is the concept of a ruler. Pompey listened to all 3 parties and did what a Roman commander with a Nabatean campaign already planned always does. He postponed. He would settle Judea later, he said. And in the meantime, nobody was to move. Aristobulus moved. He left in anger and fortified himself at Alexandrium, the fortress on its cone of rock above the Jordan Valley. Pompey marched. Aristobulus came down, negotiated, and surrendered the fortress. Then he fled to Jerusalem and prepared to resist. Pompey followed him through Jericho. Aristobulus lost his nerve again, came out again, and this time promised money and the surrender of the city itself. Pompey sent his officer Aulus Gabinius ahead to collect. Gabinius arrived at the gates and found them shut, the promised money nowhere, and the war party inside in no mood to hand over anything. That was the end of Roman patience. Pompey arrested Aristobulus in his own camp and marched on Jerusalem, and now the city had to decide what it was without a king to decide for it. It split. The supporters of Hyrcanus, the aristocracy, and the merchants, who could count legions, opened the gates and let the Romans into the city. The supporters of Aristobulus withdrew onto the Temple Mount, cut the bridge that crossed the central valley from the upper city to the platform, and prepared to hold the sanctuary against the Roman Republic. So Rome's first conquest of Judea would not be the storming of a capital, it would be the siege of a temple. And every conqueror who follows in this story is going to end up in exactly the same place, standing at the foot of the same platform, working out how to get up it. How did Pompey capture Jerusalem? Start with the ground, because the ground here does not change for 200 years, and it dictates every siege in this video. Jerusalem sits on a spur of the Judean hills. To the east, the Kidron Valley cuts it off from the Mount of Olives in a steep drop. To the south and west, the Valley of Hinnom does the same. The temple platform occupies the northeastern shoulder of that spur. and it is protected on the east and the south by those ravines and by its own massive retaining walls. There is only one direction from which an army can approach the platform on level ground and bring up heavy equipment, and that direction is north. Everything else is a cliff or a climb. Pompey looked at the same problem every commander in this story will look at and reached the same conclusion. He camped on the north side, inside the city his allies had handed him, and began to build. The Romans filled the ditch that protected the platform on its northern face and raised an assault ramp of earth and timber. Siege towers were brought overland from Tyre and dragged up into the hills, which is a considerable feat in itself and tells you how seriously Pompey was taking a fortification he had been assured would open its gates. Artillery went onto the bank. Then the pounding started, and it did not achieve very much, because the temple's northern defenses were the strongest man-made structure between Egypt and Antioch. What broke the siege was not engineering, it was the calendar. Josephus explains the mechanism plainly, and it is one of the most consequential technical details in ancient siege warfare. The defenders on the platform observed the Sabbath, and their understanding of the law at that moment permitted them to fight when they were directly attacked, in defense of their lives, but did not permit them to interfere with work that was not itself an assault. So if a Roman soldier came at them with a sword on the Sabbath, they fought him. If a Roman engineer spent the Sabbath shoveling earth onto a ramp 40 paces away, they watched. Pompey found out, and Pompey, who was a superb administrator before he was anything else, did the obvious thing. He suspended offensive action on the seventh day and put his entire engineering effort into it. Every Sabbath the towers crept forward, the ramp rose, the platforms were leveled, the artillery was repositioned, and not a single missile came off the wall to stop it. One day in 7, the Roman army worked in perfect safety, in full view of the men it was going to kill. This went on for 3 months. Think about what that looks like from the parapet. Every 7th dawn, your enemy walks out into the open with baskets and mattocks and starts making the thing that will kill you taller, and you stand there holding a bow. And the law you are defending the temple to preserve is the reason you cannot shoot. That is the position the defenders of Jerusalem accepted. And they accepted it for 12 weeks, which is either the most disciplined act of religious observance in military history or the most catastrophic. And it was probably both. The end came when the ramp finally carried a tower into range of the great tower on the northern wall, and the battering began in earnest. The wall tower fell, and the breach opened, and the assault went in. The first man over the rubble, according to Josephus, was Faustus Cornelius Sulla, the son of the dictator who had marched on Rome itself 20 years before. 2 centurions came over behind him with their centuries, and the platform was lost. What followed was a massacre in a sanctuary. Some defenders were cut down in the courts. Some were burned in their own quarters. Some threw themselves off the platform into the ravine rather than be taken. Josephus puts the dead at 12,000, and that is his figure. Which is the first of several dozen times in this video that you are going to hear a number attributed to a man who was not there and had reasons to want it large. But the character of the killing is not in doubt, because of what the Romans saw when they reached the inner court. The priests were still performing the service. The daily sacrifice was in progress. It had been in progress, by law, every day of the siege, and the priests on duty had made the decision that it would continue to be in progress no matter who came through the door. Legionaries entered the court with the killing already general, and the men at the altar did not run and did not stop. They were cut down at their stations, mid-ritual, while the offering burned. Josephus, who is our source, and who is not usually inclined to make the war party look good, cannot resist the image, and he is right not to. Everything Rome was about to spend 2 centuries failing to understand about this country is standing at that altar, refusing to look up. And then the strangest scene of the first conquest. Pompey went inside. He walked into the sanctuary with his officers, past the veil, into the Holy of Holies, the room that one man entered one day a year. No Roman had ever seen it. There is every reason to think he expected to find the God of the Jews in there, in the form every other people in the Mediterranean kept their gods, cast in gold and worth carrying home. He found an empty room. No statue, no image, nothing but darkness, and the furniture of a cult with no face. Josephus says the sacred treasures and the temple gold, an enormous sum, were also in there, and that Pompey touched none of it. The next day he ordered the sanctuary cleansed and the sacrifices resumed. That restraint bought Rome 60 years of relative quiet, and it is worth pausing on how thoroughly the Romans failed to understand what they had just done anyway. To Pompey, walking into the room and leaving the money was clemency. To the men who wrote about it afterward in Jerusalem, the room had been entered, and that could not be undone by leaving the plate on the table. The settlement was efficient and humiliating. Hyrcanus II was reinstalled as high priest, but not as king, because Judea was not going to have a king. The country was stripped of everything the Hasmoneans had conquered. The coastal cities were detached and rebuilt as free Greek towns. The cities beyond the Jordan were grouped into the league that becomes the Decapolis. Samaria was separated out. What was left was Judea, Idumea, Galilee, and Perea, tributary to Rome, supervised from the new province of Syria. Aristobulus II, his 2 sons and 2 daughters, went to Italy to walk in front of Pompey's chariot in the greatest triumph the Republic had ever staged. The turning point of the siege of 63 BC was not the falling tower. It was the first Sabbath, when Pompey's engineers realized they could build in daylight without being shot at. Jerusalem was lost on the calendar 11 weeks before it was lost on the wall. And the reason the defenders lost is the reason nearly every defender in this video loses. They had no relief force, because the only army that could have relieved them was the one their own countrymen had marched into the city and handed the keys to. A garrison with no field army outside, it is not defending a fortress. It is waiting inside a very expensive coffin, and the Roman army had unlimited patience and imported towers. Rome now believed Judea was a solved problem. It had a compliant high priest, a smaller border, a tax obligation, and a Roman garrison in Syria within marching distance. On paper, the first conquest was complete. It lasted about 6 years. Why did the first conquest not hold? Because Rome had removed the crown, but left everyone who wanted to wear it alive. Aristobulus went to Italy. His elder son, Alexander, did not. He escaped his escort on the road and was back in Judea by 57 BC with a war chest, and within a season he had 10,000 infantry and 1,500 horse, and was refortifying Alexandrium, Hyrcania, and Machaerus, the 3 fortresses that guard the eastern approaches. The proconsul of Syria at that moment was Aulus Gabinius, the same officer who had been left standing outside the gates of Jerusalem 4 years earlier, and he came south in a bad mood, with a cavalry commander on his staff, named Marcus Antonius. The rebels were caught near Jerusalem and broken in open field. Josephus says, 3,000 dead and 3,000 prisoners. Alexander ran for Alexandrium and was besieged there, and his mother negotiated his surrender in exchange for the lives of the family still held in Rome. Gabinius took the fortress and pulled it down, and then he did something more interesting. He divided the country into 5 administrative districts with 5 councils and no central authority at all, sitting at Jerusalem, Gazara, Amathus, Jericho, and Sepphoris. It was a serious attempt to solve Judea by disassembling it. It lasted about as long as it took the next Hasmonean to land. That was 56 BC, and it was Aristobulus himself, escaped from Rome with his son Antigonus, gathering men within days of coming ashore. He was chased to Machaerus, held out 2 days behind unfinished walls, and was shipped back to Italy in chains. The Senate, showing more mercy than sense, let his children go home. Alexander rose again the following year, and this time the fighting reached the north. The armies met near Mount Tabor, the isolated dome that stands out of the Jezreel Valley like a fist, and Gabinius destroyed him, 10,000 dead, by the count of Josephus. Now watch what Rome does with the country in between these revolts, because this is the part that turns resentment into something harder. In 54 BC, Marcus Licinius Crassus arrived in Syria on his way to invade Parthia. He needed money. He went to Jerusalem, and he emptied the temple treasury. He took the 2,000 talents that Pompey had deliberately left untouched, and then he took the gold as well, several thousand talents more, stripping the sanctuary of the plate that Pompey had looked at and walked away from. A priest named Eleazar tried to buy him off with a single beam of solid gold on the condition that he leave the rest. Crassus took the beam, and the rest. Within a year, Crassus was dead in the desert at Carrhae, his army annihilated by the Parthians, his legionary eagles carried off to a foreign temple, his head used as a stage property in a Greek tragedy performed at a Parthian wedding. In Jerusalem, nobody had to explain to anybody what had happened to the man who robbed the temple. The connection made itself, and it made itself again every time it was told. Then Cassius came, the same Gaius Cassius Longinus who will one day put a knife into Julius Caesar. He put down another revolt, and he settled the town of Tarichaea on the Sea of Galilee by selling 30,000 of its people into slavery. Mark that town. Remember its name. In 120 years, a Roman army is going to do the exact same thing to the exact same place, and it is going to be worse. The rest of the decade goes the way the rest of the Roman world goes. Caesar crosses the Rubicon. Pompey runs east and dies on an Egyptian beach. Caesar is trapped in Alexandria with too few men, and the relief column that saves him is raised in Judea and led by Antipater the Idumean, who fights his way in and is rewarded with Roman citizenship, tax exemption, and the practical government of the country as procurator, with Hyrcanus left in place as high priest and ethnarch, and increasingly as furniture. Antipater put his sons to work. The elder, Phasael, got Jerusalem. The younger, a hard, athletic, ferociously capable young man of about 25, got Galilee. His name was Herod, and the first thing he did in office was hunt down a bandit chief named Hezekiah and execute him on the spot without trial. The Jerusalem council summoned him to answer for it, because a governor who kills without a court is not a governor, he is a warlord. Herod arrived at the hearing in purple with an armed bodyguard. Josephus says the counselors looked at him and lost their voices, and only one man, Samius, had the nerve to say aloud that this young man was going to kill every person in the room. Herod was warned by night to leave, and he left, and he came back with an army to besiege the city, and only his father and brother talked him out of storming it. That is the man Rome is about to make king. Everyone in Jerusalem could already see exactly what he was. Caesar was murdered in 44 BC. Antipater was poisoned at a banquet in 43. Cassius came back through Syria, squeezing the province for the coming civil war, and Herod paid his share first and fastest, which is the single most Herodian act in his early career. Then Philippi, then Antony in the east, then Antony confirming the two brothers in power over the loud objections of Jewish delegations who traveled all the way to Bithynia to tell him these men were tyrants. So conquest number 1 ends in the worst possible configuration. Rome has stripped the country of its kings, but every claimant is still breathing. It has installed a family that half the aristocracy considers foreign. It has robbed the temple once, sold a town into slavery, and cut the country into pieces and put it back together twice. And it has done all of it while its own republic tore itself to shreds, which means that for 20 years the strongest force in Judean politics has not been Rome. It has been whichever Roman was losing at the moment. In 40 BC, a Roman was about to lose very badly indeed, and Judea was going to be conquered again by somebody else entirely. Look at the east. In the spring of 40 BC, Rome's civil wars have hollowed out the frontier. The legions of Syria have been raised, spent, defeated, and re-raised so many times that the province is being held together by improvisation, and half of the men in it were following Cassius 18 months ago. Antony is in Egypt, Octavian is fighting in Italy, and on the far side of the Euphrates, the Parthians have been watching all of it with great attention, and they have a Roman renegade named Quintus Labienus to show them how the province works. For the map, the invasion comes in 2 arrows. The crown prince Pacorus drives down the coast, taking the Phoenician cities one by one, Aratus, Sidon, Ptolemais, everything except Tyre, which holds because it is an island. Barzapharnes drives through the interior with Labienus, and Labienus keeps going north and west until he is in Asia Minor, which means the Parthian Empire is now operating over 500 miles inside Roman territory. Syria falls in a single campaign season, and with Syria gone, Judea is not a Roman province with a Roman garrison behind it. Judea is an unclaimed prize, sitting directly in the path of a Parthian army, and there is one man alive with a legitimate Hasmonean claim, an old grudge, and nothing to lose. 23 years after Pompey stood in the empty room, the second conquest begins. How did Parthia hand Judea to a Hasmonean? Antigonus, the surviving son of Aristobulus II, had spent his adult life being defeated. Now, he simply bought an army. Josephus records the price he offered the Parthians: 1,000 talents of silver and 500 women of the leading families. That figure comes from a source who despised Antigonus and wrote under the dynasty that destroyed him, so treat the details with suspicion. But the transaction itself is beyond doubt, because a Parthian cavalry force duly rode south into Judea in support of his claim. The country rose to meet him. That fact matters. Whatever the aristocracy thought of Antigonus, thousands of ordinary Judeans took up arms for the last Hasmonean against the Idumean brothers, and the fighting reached Jerusalem itself during the festival of Shavuot, with pilgrims and partisans battling through the streets and around the temple. Then came the trick. A Parthian officer proposed a negotiation. Phasael and the old high priest Hyrcanus rode out to meet the Parthian general in Galilee under safe conduct, ignoring Herod, who told them plainly that the entire proposal was a trap. It was a trap. Both men were seized and chained. What happened next was surgical rather than merely cruel. Antigonus mutilated his uncle Hyrcanus, cutting off his ears. Josephus, in one version, says he bit them off himself. The point was not pain. Under the law, a man with a physical blemish cannot serve as high priest. In one act, Antigonus permanently disqualified the only rival claimant to the office he wanted, and did it in a way no amount of Roman patronage could reverse. Hyrcanus, who had been maneuvered, deposed, restored, and managed by every ambitious man in his own family for 30 years, was finally rendered useless, and therefore, for the first time, safe. Phasael was not safe. Held in chains and knowing what was coming, he killed himself by beating his own head against the stone of his cell. Josephus says he heard before he died that his brother had escaped and took it as good news. Herod escaped by night with his mother, his sister, his fiancée Mariamne, and everyone in his household who could travel, running south for the desert with Parthian and Judean pursuit on his heels. Somewhere on that road, the wagon carrying his mother overturned. Josephus says Herod thought she was dead, drew his sword, and was about to fall on it, and that his household physically stopped him. It is the only moment in his recorded life where he gives up. He was talked out of it, the wagon was righted, his mother was alive, and he never came close to that edge again in 40 years, which is arguably the problem. He fought a rearguard action all the way to the rock of Masada, put his family inside it under his brother Joseph with 800 men, and rode on. Petra shut its gates against him. Egypt offered him a command, and Cleopatra offered him a ship, and he took the ship and sailed into the winter Mediterranean, which is not something sane men did, and was nearly lost off roads. He reached Rome with nothing, no army, no country, no money that was not borrowed, and a rival sitting in Jerusalem wearing the crown. He left with a kingdom. Antony backed him immediately, because Antony had known him for 15 years and needed somebody in Judea who would fight Parthia rather than pay it. Octavian backed him too, which in the winter of 40 BC is genuinely remarkable, because the two of them were agreeing on almost nothing else. The Senate met, heard the case, declared Antigonus an enemy of the Roman people, and named Herod king of the Jews. The whole process took about a week. And then, because this was Rome, the new king walked in procession from the Senate house up to the Capitol between Antony and Octavian to sacrifice to Jupiter Optimus Maximus, and to deposit the decree of his kingship in the temple of the chief god of the Roman state. Sit with that image, because it is the entire second conquest compressed into one afternoon. A king of the Jews, crowned by a foreign senate, walking up to a pagan temple to give thanks to a god he cannot worship, in a city his subjects will never see, over a country he does not currently control a single village of. He now had to go and take it. How do you fight an enemy who lives inside a cliff? Herod landed at Ptolemais in the spring of 39 BC and started raising troops before he had a Roman escort worth the name. Rome had sent Publius Ventidius Bassus east, and Ventidius had done something nobody expected, beating the Parthians in 3 straight campaigns and killing the crown prince Pacorus at Gindaris, which ended the Parthian occupation of Syria. That was the good news. The bad news for Herod was that the Roman officers left behind to support him, first Ventidius himself and then Silo, discovered that Antigonus would pay them to be slow, and being slow is a service a Roman officer can render with total deniability. So Herod fought his first year mostly with his own men. He relieved his family at Masada, took Idumea, took the coast, and drove north into Galilee, and Galilee, which had been the family's own province, gave him more trouble than anywhere else. He took Sepphoris in a snowstorm while the garrison ran, and then he ran into the caves. The country behind the western shore of the Sea of Galilee rises into the cliffs of Arbela. It is a wall of rock several hundred feet high, and the face of it is pocked with cave mouths, natural chambers widened by generations of use, connected inside, provisioned, and reachable only by paths that a single man can hold against 50. Fighters had gone into them with their families and their livestock, and they had no intention of coming out. Look at the tactical problem honestly, because this is a puzzle with no orthodox solution. You cannot assault a cave mouth uphill on a ledge, because the ledge is too narrow to bring numbers to bear, and everything you do is visible for an hour before you arrive. You cannot starve them out quickly, because they have water and stores inside the rock, and you are camped in the open, in hostile country, with a war to finish. You cannot mine, because it is solid limestone. You cannot burn them out from below, because heat and smoke go up the face and not into the holes. There is no siege manual entry for this. Herod stood at the bottom of that cliff for days. Then he built cages. Josephus describes it precisely, and it is the single most cinematic engineering solution of the Second Conquest. Herod had large boxes constructed, chained them to iron gear, and had them lowered from the top of the cliff down the face, with soldiers inside them. The cages swung against the rock, level with the cave mouths, hanging over a drop of hundreds of feet. The men inside had long poles with hooks on them, and javelins, and fire. What follows is a fight nobody trained for. The cages come down and start swinging. The soldiers inside hook the men in the cave mouths and drag them out into the air. Others hurl bundles of burning material into the openings, and the smoke rolls back out of the rock face, and the country underneath watches a cliff appear to catch fire from the inside. Defenders come to the mouths to cut the chains and are shot. Cages are hauled back up, refilled, lowered again. It goes on for days, cave by cave, opening by opening, up and down a cliff face, and the fighting is happening entirely in midair. Some of the caves were cleared with fire and hooks, some of them were offered terms. And it is at one of the mouths that this campaign produces the moment that tells you what the next 2 centuries in this country are going to feel like. Josephus reports that an old man was inside one of the caves with his wife and 7 children. They asked for permission to come down and surrender under the terms Herod had offered. The old man stood at the mouth and made them come out one at a time, and killed each of them as they came, and then killed his wife, and threw the bodies down the cliff. Herod was below, watching, and Josephus says he stretched out his right hand and called up to the old man and begged him to spare the last of them and promised him anything. The old man answered by insulting Herod's birth, and then stepped off the edge after his family. Narrate that without music. There is no lesson in it. It is simply what a man in that country decided, in that decade, was preferable to accepting terms from a king Rome had appointed, and Herod, who was not a sentimental person, remembered it for the rest of his life and told it to somebody, because that is how it reached us. The turning point of Arbela was geometrical. The caves were designed against attack from below and from the sides, and they were perfect against both. Nobody had built them with a mind to men descending on chains from above. because until Herod, nobody did that. The verdict on the defenders is the same verdict that is going to be handed down again and again in this story, at Gamla, at Machaerus, at Masada, and in the tunnels under the Judean hills. A refuge with one entrance is a fortress, right up until the moment your enemy invents a second entrance, and then it is a box. Galilee was pacified. It did not stay pacified. The moment Herod marched south, a revolt broke out behind him and his own commander in the north was killed. That pattern is going to become extremely familiar. How did Herod take his own capital? Slowly, and with almost no help. Silo, the Roman officer supposedly assisting him, spent the winter of 39 and 38 BC finding reasons not to fight and taking money from Antigonus to have them. Herod fed the Roman troops out of his own supply, quartered them in his own territory, and finally sent them off to winter quarters because they were more useful somewhere else. He then had to break off the siege of Jerusalem entirely, twice, to go and put out fires elsewhere, once in Galilee, once to escort Antony's grain convoys, and once because Antony wanted him at the siege of Samosata in the far north, which was several hundred miles in the wrong direction. While he was away at Samosata, his brother Joseph took the army out against orders, walked into a defeat near Jericho, and was killed. Antigonus had his head cut off, and Herod's family had to pay 50 talents to get the body back. The rebels who won that fight then went into Galilee and drowned Herod's supporters in the lake. Herod came back from Samosata with 2 Roman legions and the personal favor of Antony, and he came back in a state that even his own historian finds alarming. He drove into Galilee in the snow, cleared the north, took the caves again, and then met Antigonus's general Pappus at Isana, and beat him so comprehensively that Josephus describes the survivors packed into the buildings of the village while Herod's men tore the roofs off and killed them from above. Pappus was killed, and Herod had his head sent to his surviving brother Pheroras because Pappus had commanded the army that killed Joseph. And then, that same evening, comes one of the strangest recorded moments in the whole conquest. Herod went to bathe. He dismissed his attendants except for one servant, and went into the bathhouse of the village, and while he was in there, unarmed and naked, an armed enemy soldier came out of the inner room, having hidden there through the massacre. Then another, then a third. They walked past the king of Judea, one by one, with swords in their hands, and out the door, and away. Josephus says they were too terrified to strike. Perhaps they wanted to live more than they wanted to be famous. Whatever the reason, the entire subsequent history of Judea, the Herodian dynasty, the client kingdom, the procurators, and everything downstream of it, hung for about 30 seconds on the nerve of 3 frightened men in a steam room, and they blinked. By the spring of 37 BC, there was nothing left of Antigonus's kingdom except the city that Herod had been legally king of for 3 years and had never once entered. The Siege of Jerusalem in 37 BC opens on the same ground as the Siege of 63, and the script of it will be almost familiar. Camp on the northern side, raise banks. 2 walls to break, because this time the city itself is going to be defended and not handed over. The ravines close the east and the south. Everything goes in from the north. What is different is the weight. Antony sent Gaius Sosius, the governor of Syria, with a real army. Josephus gives 11 legions and 6,000 cavalry with additional Syrian auxiliaries, which is almost certainly inflated in the way ancient siege numbers usually are, but the scale of the operation is not in dispute. This was not a Roman officer being paid to be slow. This was the full weight of the Eastern Command, brought south to install a client king and to do it fast, because Antony had a Parthian war to plan and wanted Judea settled. The city held out for months anyway. There were 2 things working for the defenders. The first was the fortifications, which were the strongest in the region and would only get stronger under the man currently besieging them. The second was faith, of a specific and dangerous kind. That year was a sabbatical year, when the land lay fallow by law. The countryside had not been sown. There were no standing crops for the besiegers to harvest, and no fresh harvest for the besieged to have stored. It meant hunger came into the city early, and it meant hunger came into it hard. And still they fought. because a substantial part of the population had made a decision that the Romans found incomprehensible, and that Josephus, writing a century later under Roman patronage, finds it necessary to explain twice. They would rather starve under the last Hasmonean than open the gate to an Idumean, whom Rome had crowned in the temple of Jupiter. Some of them came out through the lines to buy food and were killed. Some of them, according to Josephus, offered sacrifices at extraordinary expense throughout the siege, importing animals at ruinous prices while people starved because the offering had to continue. The Romans built for 40 days and took the first wall. They built for 15 more and took the second. And then the city came apart in the way cities always come apart, in the outer court of the temple, in the upper city, in the streets, house to house, with a professional army that had been sitting outside in the field for months and had watched its friends die on the ramps. The sack was total, and Herod's response to it is the most revealing thing he ever did. He tried to stop it. He begged Sosius. He went among the Roman troops in person, pulling men off, shouting that they were going to leave him king of a desert. When shouting failed, he paid. He handed out money from his own funds, unit by unit, man by man, buying his soldiers away from the plunder of the city he was about to rule, and he bought off Sosius himself with a lavish gift. And Sosius made a great show of dedicating a golden crown to the god of the temple before he marched his army out. Think about what that scene actually is. A man has spent 3 years and everything he owns fighting his way to a throne, and on the day he finally wins it, he has to stand in the ruins and purchase his own capital back from his own victorious allies, one bribe at a time, before they finish destroying the thing he came to inherit. Antigonus, the last Hasmonean king, came out of the citadel and threw himself at the feet of Sosius. The Roman general called him Antigone, a woman's name, and had him put in irons and sent to Antony at Antioch. And there Rome did something it had never done. Antony had him scourged, bound to a stake, and beheaded. Cassius Dio says plainly that no other king had ever been treated by the Romans this way. Kings were paraded in triumphs. Kings were kept as pensioners. Kings were quietly disposed of years later. Kings were not flogged like slaves and executed to order. Josephus and Dio both indicate that Antony did it at Herod's urging and at Herod's expense, because as long as Antigonus was alive somewhere in Italy, every Judean who hated the new king had an address to write to. So, the second conquest of Judea was completed by a Roman army, on behalf of a king who was Rome's client and his country's enemy, over the corpse of a dynasty that Rome itself had first defeated 76 years earlier. The turning point of the siege was not the wall. It was the sabbatical year, which meant the defense started hungry and never had a harvest to look forward to, and hunger set the clock that the rams merely finished. The reason the defenders lost is that there was nobody left in Asia who could relieve them. Parthia had been driven back over the Euphrates by Ventidius, and once Parthia was gone, an isolated city facing the undivided attention of the Roman East had a mathematical outcome, and the only variable was how many months. What did 33 years of Herod buy? It bought Rome the longest period of quiet Judea would ever have, and it built every single stage on which the Great War was going to be fought. Herod ruled until 4 BC, and he ruled like a man who never once forgot that he had entered his capital over its own rubble. He killed the surviving Hasmoneans methodically, starting with his teenage brother-in-law, drowned in a swimming pool at Jericho by companions who were playing too roughly, and ending with his own wife Mariamne, the last Hasmonean princess, and eventually 2 of his own sons. He built a police state, and he built it in stone. Follow the map as it lights up, because these are the names you are going to need. At Masada, the isolated mesa in the desert above the Dead Sea, where he had left his family during his flight, he built a fortress with a casemate wall around the entire rim, storehouses, barracks, 12 enormous cisterns cut into the rock and fed by dams in the wadis below, and a palace hanging down the northern cliff face in 3 terraces. It was an escape hatch for a king who expected, all his life, to need one. At Herodium, 7 miles south of Jerusalem, on the spot where he had beaten a pursuing force during that same flight, he raised an artificial mountain. He built a circular fortified palace and then buried its lower half in an engineered cone of earth, making a hill where no hill had been, so that his monument would be visible from Jerusalem forever. He was buried there. At Machaerus, across the Dead Sea on the eastern heights, he refortified the Hasmonean citadel that guards the approach from Nabatea. On the coast he built Caesarea, a Greek city with a harbor made of hydraulic concrete poured into the open sea, one of the great engineering achievements of the ancient world, and gave it a temple to Rome and Augustus that could be seen by ships far out. In Jerusalem he built 3 great towers into the western wall of the city and named them for his brother, his friend, and his dead wife. He built a fortress called the Antonia against the northwestern corner of the temple platform, joined to the courts by stairs, so that a Roman garrison could come down into the sanctuary in under a minute. And then he rebuilt the temple itself. He doubled the platform to some 35 acres, the largest sacred enclosure in the Roman Empire, raised on retaining walls of stones weighing dozens of tons, and in some cases hundreds, cut so precisely that they needed no mortar. He employed 1,000 priests as masons so that no unconsecrated hand touched the sanctuary. The work went on for decades after his death, and the saying about it is that whoever had not seen Herod's building had never seen a beautiful building in his life. Remember every one of those names: Masada, Herodium, Machaerus, the Antonia, the temple platform. Herod did not build a country. He built a set of positions, and in 100 years his own people are going to fight and die in every single one of them against the empire that made him. He died in 4 BC, in agony, at Jericho, having ordered the execution of another son 5 days earlier. And then the settlement fell apart, with astonishing speed. The kingdom was divided among 3 surviving sons. Riots at Passover killed thousands. A revolt broke out across the country in the summer of 4 BC, in Galilee, in Perea, and in Judea, with a slave named Simon crowning himself, and a shepherd named Athronges doing the same. And the governor of Syria, Varus, had to bring in 2 legions to put it down. Josephus says he crucified 2,000 men. That is the same Varus who, 13 years later, lost 3 legions in the Teutoburg forest. The eldest son, Archelaus, was so bad at ruling Judea that a joint delegation of Jews and Samaritans, 2 groups who agreed on almost nothing, traveled to Rome to ask Augustus to remove him. Augustus removed him, and in 6 AD, Rome stopped experimenting. Judea, Samaria, and Idumea were annexed and placed under direct Roman administration, governed by a prefect of equestrian rank based at Caesarea, with the legions of Syria available if needed. And the first thing a new Roman province gets is a census, because a province is a tax base, and a tax base has to be counted. The census of Quirinius triggered the revolt of Judas the Galilean, and Judas is important not for what he did, which was fail, but for what he said. Josephus reports that he and a Pharisee named Zadok preached that the census was the beginning of slavery, that paying tribute to Rome was an admission that Rome was master, and that the nation had no master but God. Josephus calls it the 4th philosophy, alongside the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, and he says it was identical to the Pharisees in every respect except this one, an unquenchable passion for liberty that made its followers indifferent to death and to the deaths of their families. That movement did not go away. It went underground for 60 years, and it acquired a working method and a nickname. Men who carried short curved daggers under their cloaks, who moved in festival crowds, and who killed collaborators in broad daylight and then joined the shouting. The Romans called them Sicarii, the dagger men. Conquest number 2 held for a lifetime, because Herod was ruthless enough to hold it, and Rome was smart enough to let him. Conquest number 3 is going to require 4 legions, the future emperor of Rome, and the destruction of the city. Look at Judea in the year 66 AD, and look at it the way Rome does. The governor does not live in Jerusalem. He lives at Caesarea on the coast, in Herod's Greek city with the artificial harbor, because that is where the ships come in and where the roads to Antioch begin. Jerusalem is a place he visits at festivals with extra troops, the way you visit a room with a gas leak while carrying a lamp. North of the plain is Galilee, dense with villages and small walled towns, some of the most intensively farmed land in the eastern Mediterranean. East of the hills, the Jordan Rift runs down to the Dead Sea, and along its edges Herod's fortresses still stand and are still garrisoned. South is Idumea and desert. And now trace the road that is going to decide the first act of this war. It runs south from Antioch along the coast through Ptolemais and Caesarea, and then it turns inland at the plain through Lydda and begins to climb. The ascent from the coastal plain into the Judean hills goes through a saddle between two villages, an upper one and a lower one, both called Beth Horon. It is the historic invasion road to Jerusalem, and it has one feature that has been killing armies on it since the Bronze Age. It is narrow, it is steep, and there is high ground on both sides for miles. An army marching up. It cannot stay in formation. It has to stretch out into a ribbon. Hold on that pass. Rome is about to lose a legion's honor in it. 129 years have passed since Pompey stood in the empty room, 60 of them under direct Roman tax collection. Before this act goes any further, you need to meet the man that all of it comes through. Almost everything that follows comes from one source. His name at birth was Yosef ben Mattityahu. He was born in Jerusalem around 37 AD into a priestly family with Hasmonean blood on his mother's side. He visited Rome as a young man on a legal errand and came home convinced that the empire was unbeatable. When the war broke out anyway, he accepted a commission from the rebel government and was sent to organize the defense of Galilee. He lost. He surrendered. He was kept as a prisoner, then freed, and he spent the rest of the war standing outside the walls of Jerusalem in a Roman camp, shouting at his own countrymen to give up. Afterwards, he went to Rome, received citizenship, a pension, an apartment in the emperor's former house, and the family name of the dynasty that had burned his city, Flavius Josephus. He is the reason we know any of this in detail, and he is compromised in every direction at once. He wrote about a war he had lost, under the patronage of the men who won it, for an audience that included the general who burned the temple, while trying to persuade Greek and Roman readers that his nation was ancient and honorable, and that the war had been the fault of a criminal minority. Every one of those pressures shows up in the text. So here is the policy for the rest of this video. Stated once, his geography is good and repeatedly confirmed by excavation. His eyewitness detail is often extraordinary and sometimes verifiable. His numbers are inflated, frequently by an order of magnitude. His speeches are literary compositions, including speeches delivered by men who died with no survivors. And his account of his own conduct is always, somehow, defensible. When he is doing something suspicious, this script will say so at the moment he does it. Watch for it. Why did Judea explode? Not because of one thing. Because of 60 years of small things arriving in the same order every time. The prefects and procurators who governed Judea after 6 AD were middle-ranking Roman officials in a difficult posting, and the good ones are invisible to us because nothing happened. The bad ones left marks. Pontius Pilate brought military standards, bearing the emperor's image into Jerusalem by night, and found a crowd from the city lying down in front of his tribunal at Caesarea for 5 days, offering their necks to his soldiers rather than accept it, and he backed down. Later, he took money from the temple treasury to build an aqueduct, which was a public work the city needed, and when the crowds protested, he had soldiers in plain clothes mingle among them with clubs, and a great many people were beaten to death. Then, in the year 40 AD, came the crisis that should have ended everything early. The Emperor Gaius, whom we call Caligula, ordered a colossal statue of himself installed in the temple. The governor of Syria, Petronius, was told to escort it there with 2 legions. What he found when he came south was an entire population, tens of thousands of them, at Ptolemais and then at Tiberias, unarmed, refusing to sow their fields, and telling him that he would have to kill the whole nation before the statue went up. Petronius, to his eternal credit, stalled. He wrote to the emperor, explaining the practical difficulties, which was an act that could reasonably be expected to kill him. He was ordered to commit suicide. The letter carrying that order was delayed at sea, and before it arrived, another ship brought the news that Gaius had been murdered in a corridor in Rome. That is how close the Great Revolt came to happening 26 years early, and the near miss taught both sides the wrong lesson. Rome concluded that the Judeans always backed down. The Judeans concluded that God intervened. There was one last good stretch, the 3-year reign of Agrippa I over a reunified kingdom, and then he died suddenly at Caesarea in 44, and direct rule came back, and it came back worse. Cumanus was governor when a soldier on guard duty at the temple during Passover made an obscene gesture at the crowd, and the riot that followed killed, by the low estimate, thousands of pilgrims crushed in the exits. Felix ruled by playing factions against each other and hired assassins to kill a high priest in the temple itself, which is the moment the daggermen learned that murder inside the sanctuary was survivable. Under Festus and Albinus, banditry became an industry with political cover, and prisoners could be released for cash. And then came Gessius Florus, and even Josephus, who is normally careful with Roman reputations, does not bother to defend him. The charge is not cruelty in the usual sense. The charge is that he was a business partner of the bandits, taking a share and providing protection, and that he plundered whole towns and let cities be looted so long as he was paid. In the spring of 66, the fuse burned down in about 6 weeks. It started in Caesarea, where the Greek and Jewish populations had been fighting a legal battle over civic rights for years. A Greek landowner began building on a plot beside the synagogue in a way that reduced its access. The case went to Florus with a large payment attached. Florus took the money and left town. And on the Sabbath, somebody sacrificed birds on an upturned pot at the synagogue door, which is a targeted insult about ritual purity, and everyone understood it. The Jewish community of Caesarea took its scrolls and walked out of the city. Then Florus, in the middle of that, sent to Jerusalem and removed 17 talents from the temple treasury, claiming imperial requirements. The response was the most Judean act of political theater in the whole war. Young men went through the crowds with baskets, begging small coins for the poor procurator who was evidently in desperate need. Florus came up to Jerusalem with troops and demanded that the city hand over the comedians. The city, sensibly, would not, so he turned his soldiers loose on the upper market. They killed and they looted, and Florus had men of equestrian rank, Judeans who held Roman citizenship, scourged and crucified in front of him. Josephus gives 3,600 dead in a day, which is his number and is probably high, but the crucifixion of Roman citizens is the detail that mattered, because it meant that legal status inside the empire no longer protected you here. The city did not rise instantly. The chief priests and the aristocracy went to enormous lengths to hold it, bringing in Agrippa II to give a long public speech that Josephus records at length, and that is essentially a strategic lecture. Look at the map, Agrippa says. The Gauls are held by 1,200 men. The Germans face the Rhine legions. Britain was conquered across the ocean. Everyone in the world with better terrain and larger armies than you has tried this and failed. Your ancestors won when God was on their side, and if you go to war now, you will have to hope for that again, and you will be fighting an empire that has never lost a province. They heard him out, and then they threw stones at him and threw him out of the city. And then came the act of war itself, and it was not a battle, it was a liturgical decision. Eleazar, son of Ananias, the captain of the temple, a young man of the highest priestly aristocracy, persuaded the officiating priests to stop accepting sacrifices offered on behalf of foreigners. In practice, that meant one sacrifice above all others, the twice-daily offering made for the emperor and the Roman people, which had been made continuously since Augustus, and which was the arrangement that let Judea be part of the empire without worshipping it. The chief priests understood exactly what had happened, and said so publicly. They brought out experts on the law to argue that offerings from foreigners had always been accepted. It did not matter. The sacrifice stopped. That was the declaration of war. Rome's loyalty test in Judea was a single ritual, and Judea failed it deliberately. Within days, the country came apart. The daggermen took Masada by surprise and killed the Roman garrison and took the armory, which was substantial. In Jerusalem, the war party burned the house of the high priest, the palace of Agrippa, and the public archives, and the archives are worth a sentence of their own. Because the archive building held the debt records, Josephus says plainly that they burned it to destroy the bonds of the creditors and to bring in a crowd of debtors on their side. This war has a class war inside it. From week 1, the Roman garrison in Jerusalem withdrew into Herod's 3 towers and then negotiated a surrender with sworn oaths of safe conduct. They laid down their shields and swords and were massacred in the open. One man survived, the commander Metilius, who saved his life by agreeing to be circumcised. Josephus notes that this happened on a Sabbath and adds that on the very same day and hour, over at Caesarea, the Greeks massacred the city's Jewish population. Whether the synchrony is real or literary, the consequence is not. Across the whole eastern Mediterranean, mixed cities went up. Judean communities attacked their neighbors in the Decapolis, and Greek communities massacred Judeans in Ascalon, Ptolemais, Tyre, and finally Alexandria, where the prefect turned 2 legions loose in the Jewish quarter, and tens of thousands died. There was no way back. The only question left was how fast Rome would come and how hard. How did untrained rebels destroy a Roman legion? Cestius Gallus, the governor of Syria, assembled a field force at Antioch in the autumn of 66. He took the 12th Legion Fulminata complete, 2,000 picked men from each of the other Syrian legions, 6 cohorts of auxiliary infantry, 4 wings of cavalry, and the contingents of the client kings, including Agrippa's own troops, with Agrippa in person. Call it 30,000 men with a full baggage train and artillery. On the other side, there was no army. There were town militias, festival crowds, bandit companies that had been operating in the hills for a decade, and a scattering of aristocrats, trying to build a command structure out of them. One of the men in the hills was a young commander named Simon Bar Giora, and you should remember him, because 5 years from now, he is going to be the last man of this war to die. Cestius came down the coast and made his method clear. He burned Shabulon, a wealthy Galilean town, and let his Syrian auxiliaries strip the whole district. He took Joppa without a fight and killed everyone in it, 8,400 by the count of Josephus. He burned Lydda. Then he turned inland and started to climb, and reached Gabao, a few miles from Jerusalem, and camped. And then, the war did something nobody expected. It was the festival of Sukkot. The crowds in Jerusalem abandoned the festival, came out of the city, and attacked a Roman army in the open field. They should have been slaughtered. Instead, they broke the Roman line. Josephus says the mass of them came on with such violence that they cut through the formation, and that the Romans lost 515 men, including 400 infantry, while the Judeans lost 22. Those are his figures, and the ratio is not credible as stated. What is credible, because it is confirmed by everything that follows, is that a Roman line was broken by irregulars, that the army only stabilized when Roman cavalry took them in the flank, and that everybody on that hillside now knew it could be done. Simon Bar Giora then hit the rear of the column on the ascent, and took a substantial part of the baggage train, and drove the pack animals into Jerusalem, and the war got a great deal better supplied that afternoon. Agrippa, still trying to prevent the catastrophe, sent 2 envoys forward under safe conduct to offer terms. The war party in Jerusalem killed one of them on the spot and wounded the other, and when the peace party protested, drove them off with force. Read that action carefully. It was not aimed at Rome. It was aimed at the possibility of negotiation, which was the one thing the radicals could not survive. Cestius pushed on, camped on Mount Scopus for 3 days, burned the northern suburb of Bezetha and the timber market, and then brought his whole force against the northern wall of the temple. For 5 days it went nowhere. On the 6th day, the Romans formed the testudo, locked shields over their heads, walked up to the wall under a rain of missiles, and began to undermine the foundation and to prepare to fire the gate. And inside the city the defense wobbled. Josephus is explicit. The war party was ready to abandon the walls, and the peace party, which was large, was preparing to open the gates and let the Romans in. And Cestius withdrew. Stop here, because this is one of the genuine mysteries of Roman military history. He was a day from taking Jerusalem, possibly an hour. He had a testudo on the wall and a 5th column inside it. Josephus, who is not a neutral witness, says only that Cestius was unaware how close he was and, in a fit of discouragement, pulled back. Modern explanations vary. He had no proper siege train and could not commit to a winter siege in the hills. Supplies were short in a countryside his own men had burned. The season was turning. He may have believed that the demonstration had been made and that the city would settle. He may simply have lost his nerve. We do not know. We know only that he retreated and that his retreat killed his army. Because the moment a Roman column turns its back in that country, the entire population understands what to do. They came out of Jerusalem after him and hung on his rear all the way to Gabao. They shot into the column from the ridges. Cestius spent a day at Gabao and then made the decision that turned a bad retreat into a disaster. To move faster, he ordered the baggage cut loose. The mules and pack animals were killed where they stood so the enemy could not have them, except for those carrying the artillery and ammunition. A Roman army was now moving without its train through hostile hills, having deliberately destroyed its own supply. Then the road entered the descent at Beth Horon. Everything about that ground is wrong for an army in retreat. The road drops through a narrow defile with high ground on both sides. The column has to stretch. Cavalry cannot deploy on the slopes and cannot charge uphill onto broken rock. The legionary formation, which is the entire basis of Roman tactical superiority, requires frontage, and there is no frontage. There is a lane. The Judeans had already taken the heights and were waiting. What happened in the pass was not a battle. It was a killing. Missiles came down on a packed column that could not turn to face in either direction. Men in the rear pushed forward into men who could not move. The flanking parties climbed above the road and worked their way along it. The legionaries could not form a line, could not counterattack up the slopes without leaving the road, and could not protect the column if they did. Josephus says that the greater part of the baggage was abandoned in the defile, along with, critically, the siege engines and the artillery. By nightfall, the army was penned in the lower pass, and in Josephus's judgment, the whole force would have been destroyed the next day if darkness had not come. Cestius made the last decision of his campaign in the dark. He selected about 400 of his bravest men and posted them in the camp with orders to keep the standards flying and to show themselves on the perimeter so that the enemy would believe the army was still there. Then he took the rest of the force out silently and marched 30 stades by night before dawn. At first light, the Judeans came into the camp, found 400 men, and killed them all. The pursuit went on for miles. What was left of the column got clear and did not stop until it reached the coast. The butcher's bill, in Josephus's numbers, is 5,300 infantry and 380 cavalry dead. Flag the figures as his, but the material losses are independently damning. Rome lost its entire siege train in that pass. Ballistae, catapults, rams, and the specialist ammunition, all of it, dragged back up the road to Jerusalem by the men who had just captured it. Say that sentence slowly, because it is going to come back. 4 years from now, when Titus sits down in front of Jerusalem with 4 legions, he is going to be shot at from those walls by Roman artillery, served by Judean crews who learned to use it on Roman prisoners and deserters. And there was one more loss. Suetonius, writing about the war in his Life of Vespasian, records that in Judea an eagle had been lost. The aquila is not a flag. It is the physical object in which a legion's identity is held, guarded by the first cohort, and its loss is the disgrace that follows a unit for as long as the unit exists. The 12th Legion Fulminata went back to Syria without its eagle. The turning point of Beth Horon is easy to name, and it is not in the pass. It is at Gabao, when Cestius decided to retreat through a defile he had already marched up once, with his flanks unsecured and his baggage destroyed. The moment the head of that column entered the descent, the outcome was arithmetic. Why did the Romans lose? Because the ground abolished the thing that made them Romans. Every Roman advantage, formation fighting, articulated command, cavalry, artillery, engineering, requires space and time, and the Beth Horon descent offers neither. And because Cestius surrendered the initiative twice in a week, first by withdrawing from a wall he was about to breach, then by retreating along a road the enemy had already used against him. Against irregulars, who knew the country, fighting for their homes, with nothing to lose, and everything to avenge, that was fatal. Cestius Gallus died within a year before Nero's judgment could reach him. Josephus notes dryly that he was fortunate in the timing. In Jerusalem, the mood is not hard to imagine. The peace party's argument had been that Rome could not be beaten. Rome had just been beaten, in the open field, in the pass, and in its own camp, and the proof of it was parked outside the temple with Roman markings on the frames. How does an empire answer? Nero was in Greece, on an artistic tour, when the news reached him that a governor had lost an army and a province had declared independence. Josephus says he concealed his alarm and made a show of contempt, and then he did the arithmetic that emperors do. This required a first-rate general. It also required a general who could not use 4 legions and a triumph to make himself emperor. He picked Titus Flavius Vespasianus, and the reasons are almost insulting. Vespasian was in his late 50s. He had commanded a legion in the invasion of Britain and fought 30 engagements there, taken the Isle of Wight, and been decorated. He was as competent a field officer as Rome had. He was also from a family of tax farmers and mule dealers with no ancestors worth mentioning. He had recently fallen into disgrace for falling asleep during one of Nero's recitals, and he was so socially harmless that nobody could imagine him on a throne. Nobody in this story understands what they are starting. Nero is about to hand the Eastern armies to the man who will found the next dynasty. Vespasian moved fast. He sent his son Titus to Alexandria to bring up the 15th Legion Apollinaris, and went himself to Antioch, where he collected the 5th Legion Macedonica and the 10th Legion Fretensis, 23 auxiliary cohorts, 6 cavalry wings, and the troops of the client kings, Agrippa, Sohaemus, Antiochus, and Malchus the Nabatean. By the spring of 67, he had assembled at Ptolemais on the coast, a force of around 60,000 men. Josephus, who watched this army form up and later described its order of march in loving and slightly obsessive detail for a Greek readership that had never seen one, is very clear about what the Judean command was facing. Not brave men. A system. Auxiliary screening, engineers with the vanguard building the road as it advanced, the baggage in the middle, the legions in the center with their eagles, the artillery carried in pieces. A fortified camp, dug every single night, whether or not anyone was near. The Romans, he says, do not begin to fight when war comes. They train as though they are already fighting, so that their drills are bloodless battles and their battles are bloody drills. Meanwhile, what was Jerusalem doing? It had formed a government. The provisional regime was run by the aristocracy, with the former high priest Ananus at its head, and it was in an impossible position because it was made up largely of men who had spent the past year trying to prevent this war and were now expected to win it. It struck silver coinage, shekels of remarkable purity, bearing the legend Year 1 of the Freedom of Zion, which is one of the great acts of political defiance in metal, and it appointed regional commanders. To Galilee, the northern frontier, the first place the Roman army would arrive, the government sent a 29-year-old priest with no military experience whatsoever, Josephus. He says he raised and trained an army of 100,000 men on the Roman model, with ranks and drills and officers. That claim can be set aside. What the archaeology and the campaign both confirm is that he did fortify. The map fills in with the places he strengthened: Jotapata, Tarichae, Tiberias, Gamla in the Golan, Mount Tabor, Gischala under a man named John who despised Josephus and spent the year trying to have him removed, mostly with justification, since Josephus spent as much energy fighting his own side as preparing for Rome. Vespasian's opening move set the tone for the entire campaign. He sent a force against Giora, took it at the first assault, and killed every male of military age in it. Then he burned the town and all the villages around it and enslaved the survivors. That is the offer, stated in the only language that carries across a hostile countryside. Surrender and you will be spared, as Sepphoris was spared, having asked for a Roman garrison before the war even started. Resist, and there will be nothing left of you." Then he turned toward the place where the rebel commander of Galilee had shut himself in. What happened at Jotapata? The town sits on a rocky promontory in the hills of Lower Galilee, and the first thing to understand about it is that you cannot see it. Josephus says it is invisible until you are on top of it, because it lies below the level of the surrounding heights. Ravines fall away on three sides so sheer that Josephus reports the eye cannot reach the bottom. Only the north side connects to the neighboring ridge, and that is where Herod's engineers, and later Josephus, put the wall. And there is one more fact about Jotapata, and it is the fact that decides everything that follows. There is no spring. The town drinks from cisterns filled by winter rain. Vespasian came at it in the summer. He sent 1,000 cavalry ahead to seal the roads, then brought up his infantry, and on the second day he closed the ring completely, and camped so near the wall that Josephus says the troops could see the defenders' faces. 3 legions, plus auxiliaries, plus around 160 pieces of artillery, against a hill town containing several thousand fighters and refugees, and the 29-year-old priest who had convinced them all to stay. 5 days of direct assault got nothing, because the wall was strong, and the defenders came out over it to fight in the open, which the Romans had not expected. So Vespasian did what Romans do when men fail. He switched to engineering. The plan was to build an embankment against the north wall high enough to bring artillery and rams level with the parapet. Timber came from the hills, stone from the fields, and a mass of men went to work under wicker screens. To keep the workers alive, 160 engines went into action along the line, and Josephus, who was standing on the wall, describes what a sustained artillery bombardment does to human beings with a precision that no other ancient writer matches. Stones that carried away rows of men. Arrows in volleys thick enough to make the parapet uninhabitable. He records a man beside him on the wall struck by a ballista ball that took off his head and through the skull hundreds of feet. Use that once and move on, because the point of it is not the horror. It is that after 2,000 years, we have a man on the receiving end of Roman siege artillery telling us what it was like, and there is nothing else in ancient literature quite like it. The defenders answered the embankment by raising the wall behind it. Josephus had wooden frames erected along the parapet and hung raw ox hides over the whole face, freshly flayed, wet and heavy. Wet hide absorbs a stone strike, slides off an arrow, and does not burn. Under that cover, the masons worked, and the wall went up another 20 cubits with towers along it, and the Roman bank, which had nearly reached the top, was suddenly staring at a fresh cliff of stone. Vespasian gave up on assault and settled in to starve them out, because he now knew about the cisterns. And here the siege of Jotapata becomes a duel of expedients between two commanders who cannot get at each other, and it is the best sustained sequence of improvised siegecraft in the entire war. Josephus's first move was theater. Water was already rationed and being distributed by measure. So he had the defenders soak their clothes and hang them dripping from the battlements until the whole wall ran with water and it splashed down the face of the rock. To the Roman lines it looked like a town with water to waste. Vespasian, who had been counting on thirst, went back to force. Then the ram arrived, the largest they could build, its head sheathed in iron in the shape of the animal it is named for, slung from a frame under a roof of hides and hurdles. The first stroke shook the wall, and a cry went up inside the town. Josephus met it with sacks. Chaff-filled bags were lowered on ropes to hang exactly where the head struck, so that the blow landed in a cushion and dissipated. The Romans countered with long poles ending in scythe blades and cut the ropes, so the defenders came out. 3 men went over the wall with torches and firebrands and got in among the engines. The frames caught, the hides burned. A Roman officer named Abutius, coming to save the works, was killed. And it is here that Josephus names the man he considers the hero of the siege, a Galilean called Eleazar, son of Samius, who heaved down a stone of enormous size onto the ram and broke the head clean off the shaft, then jumped down into the middle of the Roman line, picked the iron head up off the ground, carried it back to the wall under fire, and climbed up with 5 arrows in his body. He stood on the parapet in view of both armies, and then fell. The Romans got the ram working again. So the defenders brought up boiling oil and poured it down through the gaps in the shield roof, and oil finds its way inside armor. And men who had been protected from arrows and stones and fire had no protection at all from a liquid that follows the body. Josephus describes them rolling on the ramps. And then, the strangest weapon of the entire war. The Romans were pushing assault gangways up onto the works. The defenders boiled fenugreek, the sticky legume used in Galilean cooking, until it made a slime, and poured it over the planking. Roman soldiers in hobnailed boots carrying shields walked onto their own gangways and lost their feet, sliding, going down under their own equipment, unable to stand up in the crush, and were shot where they lay. Vespasian himself was in the front line during one of these exchanges and took an arrow in the sole of his foot. It was a slight wound. The effect on the army was not slight. Josephus says the sight of the general bleeding drove the legions into a fury, and they went at the wall that day with a violence that had to be called off. On the 47th night of the siege, Jotapata fell for the reason it was always going to fall. The cisterns were finished. Josephus had made the calculation and knew the town could not hold to the end of the summer. He tried to leave, telling the leading men that he could do more good raising a relief force in Galilee, and the town would not let him go. Josephus reports that they clung to him and wept, and told him that if he stayed, they could not be beaten, and he agreed to stay. Note what he is doing in that passage. He is establishing on the record for a Roman audience that he tried to leave for good military reasons and was prevented by popular affection, and that he then chose to remain out of duty. Nobody else was in the room. A deserter got out and told Vespasian the thing that ends sieges. At the last watch before dawn, exhausted by weeks of alarms, the sentries on the north wall were sleeping at their posts. Titus took a picked party up in the dark. There was mist coming off the ravines that morning, thick enough to muffle sound and blind the wall. They went over, cut the throats of the sentries who were still where the deserter had said they would be, and opened the town from the inside. The people of Jotapata woke to legionaries already in the streets, in fog, with the wall behind them. There was fighting, but not a defense. Men who came out of houses were killed in doorways. Some threw themselves into the ravines. A group in the citadel held out and was destroyed. Roman troops, remembering 47 days and their general's foot, killed for a day, and then were ordered to take prisoners, and 1,200 women and children went into slavery. Josephus puts the total dead across the whole siege at 40,000. Test that number against the ground. The site has been excavated. The archaeology at Jotapata is unambiguous about the violence, with the wall breach, Roman arrowheads and ballista balls concentrated where Josephus puts the fighting, and human remains gathered up and deposited in cisterns sometime after the town died, which is what happens when survivors come back later to bury what they find. But the town itself, by area, held a population in the low thousands at most, even swollen with refugees. Josephus's 40,000 is not a count, it is a scale. And now the part that made his career, and that has been argued about ever since. Josephus did not die at Jotapata. He went down into a cistern cave, one of the underground water chambers, where 40 men of standing were already hidden with supplies. They stayed 2 days. On the third, a woman gave the position away, and Vespasian sent an officer to offer terms, and then sent a second officer, a man named Nicanor, whom Josephus had known personally in Rome, to guarantee them. Josephus decided to accept. The 40 men in the cave with him did not. They surrounded him with drawn swords, and told him that if he would not die honorably, he would die dishonorably, right there, and he talked. He argued that suicide was contrary to the law, that the body is lent and not owned, that a man who kills himself is refused burial by the customs of their own nation. It is a superb speech. It did not work. So he proposed a system. They would draw lots. Each man in turn would present his throat to the man whose lot came next, so that no man killed himself. Down the line, one after another, until one remained, and that one would fall on his sword. They agreed, and in that cave, 40 men were killed in sequence by their own friends. And when it was down to 2, Josephus was one of the 2, and he persuaded the other man not to finish it, and they came out and surrendered. He gives 3 explanations in one sentence in his own account: chance, or the providence of God. He does not offer a third, but every reader since has supplied it, because a man who invents the lottery is also a man in a position to run it. We cannot know. What we can say is that of 41 men in that cave, the one who survived is the one who wrote the book. He was brought to Vespasian in chains, and the soldiers wanted him executed as the commander who had cost them 47 days and a general's blood. So Josephus asked to speak to Vespasian privately and made a prophecy. "You will be Caesar," he said, "you and your son after you. Do not send me to Nero, because Nero will not be there. Keep me, and keep me in chains, and when it happens, remember who told you." Vespasian did not believe it. He also did not kill him, which tells you something. He kept him in irons as a curiosity. 2 years later, Nero was dead, and Vespasian was emperor, and one of the first things he did was send for the prisoner and have the chain cut through with an axe rather than unlocked, because a chain that is severed was never legitimately imposed. Suetonius, writing independently and not out to flatter anyone in Judea, records that there was a firm belief throughout the East that men from that country would rule the world, and that a captured Judean noble insisted on it to Vespasian, so the prophecy was circulating. Whether Josephus made it up after the fact, or made it up before the fact and got lucky, or believed it, is not answerable. What is certain is that it was the single most profitable sentence any prisoner of war has ever spoken. The turning point of Jotapata was a deserter and a sleeping watch. 47 days of engineering, artillery, oil, fire, and fenugreek did not open that wall. Exhaustion did. And the reason the town lost is written into the rock it was built on. No spring, no relief force in the field, a perimeter that needed more men awake every night than a thirsty and shrinking garrison could supply. How fast can a country die? In about 4 months, and the Galilee campaign of 67 AD is the demonstration. Jaffa was a village a couple of miles from Jotapata that had taken heart from its neighbors' resistance. It had 2 walls, an outer and an inner. When Roman auxiliaries under an officer named Trajan came at it, the defenders came out, were beaten, and ran back for the gates, and the people manning the inner wall barred the gates in their faces to keep the Romans out. Thousands of men were left trapped in the space between their own 2 walls, and were killed there by pursuers coming in behind them and by their own countrymen refusing to open. Trajan sent for Titus rather than take the town himself, which was a courtier's instinct as much as a soldier's. His son, born the year before this campaign, would be emperor within 40 years and would conquer more territory than any Roman before or since. Mount Gerizim is worse, because the people on it were not even in the war. The Samaritans, who were a distinct community with their own temple tradition and their own long quarrel with Jerusalem, gathered in arms on their holy mountain in numbers. Whether they intended to rise or simply to be somewhere defensible while the country burned around them is not clear from our one hostile source. Vespasian sent the 5th Legion to surround the mountain in the height of summer. The Samaritans had gone up without adequate water. They were offered terms, some came down, and the rest were destroyed on the summit. Josephus gives 11,600. The number is his. The circumstance, thirst on a bare hilltop in June, is entirely plausible and requires no exaggeration. Joppa on the coast had been destroyed once already by Cestius. It had been reoccupied by refugees who, having lost their land, built themselves ships and turned to piracy, and were cutting the grain traffic between Syria and Egypt. Vespasian sent a force by night, took the ruined town without a fight, and the entire population fled onto their vessels and stood offshore, out of range, riding at anchor in the open water. That night the wind got up. It is the seasonal norther that comes down that coast, and the harbor at Joppa is not a harbor, it is an open roadstead. The ships were driven against each other and onto the rocks and onto the beach. Men who jumped were drowned or dashed on the shore, and men who reached the beach were killed by the Romans waiting on it. Josephus counts 4,200 bodies on the sand at dawn. The Roman army did not fight that battle. It simply stood on the shore and waited for the weather to hand it a victory. Tiberias, meanwhile, opened its gates. Vespasian spared it entirely, took down only a section of wall, and made a point of the mercy because the city belonged to Agrippa, and because a spared city is the best recruiting poster an invading army can have. Every town in Galilee was now looking at two examples, Jotapata and Tiberias, and being invited to choose. Which brings us to the town 4 miles up the shore that did not choose in time. Why did the Sea of Galilee turn red? Tarichaea sat on the western shore of the lake, a prosperous place that lived on fish, and its name in Greek means roughly the salting works. Josephus had fortified it, but only partly, because the town's own defensive assumption was ancient and comfortable and completely wrong. On the landward side, there was a wall. On the lakeward side, there was the lake. And a lake is not a wall. It is a road with no ruts on it and no gates. And the town had a large fishing fleet sitting on it. Refugees and fighters from all over Galilee had come in, and they did not have the patience of the locals. When Vespasian sent Titus forward with 600 cavalry to reconnoiter, the rebels came out onto the plain and offered battle. Titus was outnumbered enough that he sent back for support and then addressed his horsemen while waiting, and Josephus gives us the speech, which we should treat as composition, but the tactical situation it describes is real. 600 cavalry against a large body of infantry on open ground is a fight cavalry wins if it keeps moving, and loses if it lets itself be surrounded. He charged. The Roman horse went through them, turned, and went through them again, and the rebel formation, which had never been a formation, broke back toward the town. And then Titus did the thing that ended the battle for the town before the siege had properly begun. He took his cavalry into the water. The wall stopped at the shoreline, as walls beside water do, and the shallows ran round the end of it. Titus put his horsemen through the lake, round the end of the fortifications, and into the town, and was in the streets before anyone inside had begun to think about the gates. Josephus says he had ridden in before the enemy could shut them, or the defenders on the wall knew what had happened behind them. The town split immediately along the fault line that had been there all along. The residents wanted to surrender because it was their town and their houses. The incomers wanted to fight because they had nothing left to lose and nowhere to go. In the confusion, the fighters ran for the boats and pushed out onto the water, and Titus told the Roman troops that killing residents who had never wanted this war was pointless, and the killing in the streets stopped. The killing on the lake did not. Vespasian came up and understood at once that a rebel fleet on the Sea of Galilee was a problem that would not solve itself. Fishing boats can land anywhere on either shore, resupply, and raid. So he had rafts built, quickly and in numbers, and put legionaries on them, and took the Roman army out onto the water. What follows is the only naval battle of the Judean Wars, and one of the strangest engagements in Roman military history, and the mismatch is total. The fishing boats were small, undecked, and built for nets. The rafts were platforms carrying men in armor with javelins and bows, and no need to worry about handling. The Judeans could not board a raft full of legionaries and survive it, and they could not stay out of range on a lake 8 miles across with an army on every shore. So it became a hunt. The rafts came on in line and drove the boats before them. Boats that came within range were shot to pieces. Boats that were rammed capsized, and men in the water were speared as they surfaced, or killed at the rails as they tried to climb, or had their hands cut as they gripped a raft's edge. Some swam for the shore and were killed on the beaches by troops posted for exactly that. Some, Josephus says, went under of their own accord. He describes the aftermath, and the description has stayed in every history of this war since. The water was fouled with blood and full of bodies, and for days afterward the shores of the lake stank and the whole district was unapproachable, and the corpses swelled in the summer heat. His count is 6,500 dead in the town and on the water. It is his count. What the geography confirms is that there was nowhere for those boats to go. And then the part of Tarichaea that has to be told without any tone at all. The surrendered population, residents and incomers together, was moved a short distance to Tiberias and put into the stadium there, while Vespasian decided what to do with them. He had given his word to the townspeople. His officers argued that these people would simply rebel again the moment the army left, and Vespasian's solution was the one that let him keep his word and get the outcome anyway. He announced that the incomers were free to leave by the Tiberias Road, and lined the road with troops, and when they had all filed out onto it, he had them held there. Then the sorting. 1,200, the old and the infirm and those who could not work, were killed. 6,000 young men were selected and sent to Nero in Greece, where they were put to work digging the canal at the Isthmus of Corinth, and over 30,000 were sold into slavery, with a further number handed over to Agrippa to dispose of in his own kingdom, and he sold them too. Now go back 120 years in this same video to the campaigns of Gabinius and Cassius, and remember what Cassius did after he took a town on the shore of the Sea of Galilee. He sold 30,000 people from Tarichaea into slavery. The same town. Twice, 2 Roman commanders, a century and a quarter apart, arriving at the same lakeshore and reaching the same conclusion about what to do with the people in it. And the reason they reached the same conclusion is that it was profitable. This war is also an industry. The slave markets of Tyre, Antioch, Alexandria, and Delos are downstream of every siege in this video, and Roman soldiers on campaign were not only paid in silver, they were paid in people. The turning point at Tarichaea was 600 horsemen riding through shallow water around the end of a wall. Everything after that was administration, and the reason the defenders lost is that they had built a wall to the water's edge and then assumed the water finished the job against an enemy with an engineering corps that could put an infantry battalion on a lake in under a week. How do you besiege a city? On a knife edge. Now the campaign leaves Galilee proper and crosses into the Golan, and comes to the hardest piece of ground in the entire war. Gamla is built on a ridge that runs out from a higher massif and drops away on both sides into deep ravines, and the ridge itself rises to a hump at the far end. Josephus says it looks like a camel, and Gamal is the word for camel, and the town is named for its own shape. Everything about it is vertical. The houses are stacked down the slope so steeply that each one is built into the roofline of the one below, so that the town appears to be hanging on the hillside. And it is packed together with no space between the structures. There is one approach, the saddle where the ridge joins the higher ground, and Josephus had cut a ditch across it. Agrippa II had already besieged Gamla for 7 months with his own forces and failed to take it. That is the resume of the place before Rome even arrives. Vespasian brought 3 legions up and set them to the ramps, 1 legion at the saddle, 1 against the eastern face where a tower stood, and dug in. Before the assault, Agrippa rode forward to talk to the defenders, because they were nominally his subjects, and he thought he might still save them. He came within range, and a slinger on the wall put a stone into his right elbow and broke it, and he was carried out. Take a second on that image. A client king of Rome, standing under the walls of a town in his own kingdom, appealing to his own people and being shot by them. That is the entire position of the Herodian dynasty in one throw of a sling, and it is the reason the dynasty could never be the answer to the Judean question. Rome kept appointing rulers whose legitimacy depended on Rome, in a country where depending on Rome was the disqualifying offense. The Roman effort at Gamla was standard and effective. The banks went up under artillery cover, the rams came in, and the wall was breached in 3 places at once. The legions poured through with trumpets sounding and went up the slope into the town, and then the town killed them. Because of the way Gamla is built, the defenders retreated upward, and the Romans followed, and the fighting moved up the terraces into streets that were not streets, but rooflines. The legionaries, crowded and pushing uphill, went up onto and into the houses. Josephus says the buildings, packed with far more men than they were ever built to carry, began to give way, and each collapsing house fell into the one below it, and that one fell into the next, so that the structural failure ran down the hillside in a chain. Whole sections of the town came down with Roman soldiers inside them. Men were crushed in the rubble. Men were buried alive and suffocated in the dust, which Josephus says filled the air so thickly that the Romans could not see and were killing each other in the confusion. Defenders on the higher terraces threw down stones and shot into the mess, and picked up the swords of the dead and used them. Vespasian himself was caught up the slope in the middle of this. The commander of the Roman armies in the east, the future emperor, was inside a collapsing town with his troops routing around him and no line to fall back to. Josephus, who was not there but who heard about it from men who were, says that he did not run because running downhill in that terrain with the enemy above you is death. He gathered the men immediately around him, formed them into a shield facing uphill, and walked backwards, step by step, down the slope and out through the breach, absorbing the missiles on the shields the whole way. Rome came within a very short distance of losing the general of the eastern armies to falling architecture in a Golan hill town, and everything downstream of Vespasian, the Flavian dynasty, the Colosseum, the shape of the next 30 years of Roman history, was inside that shield wall walking backwards. The army was badly shaken. Josephus says the soldiers were ashamed and demoralized, and that Vespasian had to address them, and the substance of what he said is that they had been beaten by the ground and not by the enemy, that nothing is won without risk, and that the sight of the town had made them careless. He also, notably, did not order another assault. He put the siege back on an engineering footing and waited. While Gamla was invested, an officer named Placidus was sent to deal with Mount Tabor, the isolated dome standing out of the Jezreel plain that had been fortified and garrisoned. The mountain was unassailable, and the summit had no water, and Placidus solved both problems with one trick. He offered terms, invited the defenders down to negotiate, and when a large body of them came down onto the plain intending to seize him during the parley, he broke off in a feigned retreat, drew them out onto flat ground away from the slope, and turned his cavalry loose on them. The men who had come down could not get back up. The survivors on the summit surrendered for lack of water. Back at Gamla, the siege ended the way Jotapata ended, with a handful of men doing something quiet in the dark. 3 soldiers of the 15th Legion crawled up to the base of a tower on the wall at night without being seen and began to work the foundation stones out of it. Josephus says there were 5 of them, the great stones at the base, and the men prized them free and got clear, and the tower came down on top of itself with a crash in the darkness, and the sentries on it went down with it. The defense never recovered from that noise. Titus came back from an errand to Syria, took 200 picked horsemen and some infantry, and went into the town in the early morning, quietly, and got in before the alarm. The last fight went up the ridge to the citadel on the hump at the far end, and it went up in a gale. Josephus describes a wind of extraordinary violence blowing straight into the faces of the defenders on the summit, carrying the Roman arrows up and stopping the Judean missiles dead, and making it impossible for men to stand on the narrow ground at the top or to brace themselves at the edge. He then reports the end of Gamla in 2 numbers: 4,000 killed by the Romans, 5,000 who went over the edge into the ravine, with their families, either thrown down in the crush at the summit or jumping. Treat the arithmetic with the usual suspicion. The upper town could not have held that many people standing still, and the figure of 5,000 falling is a literary total for a real horror rather than a body count. But now test Josephus against the ground, because Gamla is one of the places where he can be tested. The site was identified and excavated in the 1970s and after. The breach is there in the wall, at the eastern section, precisely where he says the Romans came through. Around it, archaeologists recovered a dense concentration of Roman arrowheads and ballista stones, some 1,600 arrowheads and 2,000 stone shot, the heaviest concentration of Roman siege ordnance found anywhere in Israel, exactly at the point of assault. The round tower at the base of which 3 men worked in the dark is there, and its collapsed stonework is there. Coins struck in the town during the siege have been found, with the legend for the redemption of Holy Jerusalem, which means that a town in the Golan, sealed and dying, was still minting the ideology of the war in its last weeks. His topography is confirmed in the dirt, his numbers are not, and the same trench proves both. 2 women survived, Josephus says, nieces of one of the rebel commanders, who hid. The turning point at Gamla was 5 stones taken out of a tower base by 3 men on a night patrol. And the reason Gamla fell is the reason Arbela fell in the Second Conquest. And the script is going to say it again at Machaerus and at Masada and in the tunnels under Judea, because it is the structural verdict on this entire war. A position with one way in has no way out. Every fortress in this country was chosen for how hard it was to enter, and each one of them, in the end, functioned as a container for the people inside it, while a besieging army with unlimited time did the arithmetic. By the end of 67 AD, Galilee was finished. Gischala, the last town, fell when its commander John slipped out at night with his fighting men, and as many followers as could keep up promised Titus he would surrender after the Sabbath, and was gone by morning. His column was overtaken on the road to Jerusalem, and the people who could not keep up, women and children mostly, were left behind and ridden down by Roman cavalry. Josephus says 6,000 died on that road and 3,000 were captured. John of Gischala arrived in Jerusalem with an armed following, a talent for organization, and a story about how weak the Romans really were. Who killed Jerusalem first? This is the part of the story that gets left out of the summaries, and it is the part that decides the war. Between the fall of Galilee at the end of 67 and the arrival of Titus in the spring of 70, Rome barely fought at all. It did not need to. The city was busy. The fighters who escaped from Galilee arrived in Jerusalem with nothing to lose and a grievance against the aristocratic government that had, in their view, sent them to be slaughtered while sitting safe behind the strongest walls in the east. They fused with the radicals already in the city into the group Josephus calls the Zealots. They took the temple platform, and they began executing members of the ruling class for treason, on the reasonable theory that men who had opposed the war might end it. Then, they did something that broke the old order permanently. They abolished the hereditary high priesthood and chose a high priest by lot from a designated priestly family on the argument that this was the ancient practice. The lot fell on a man named Phannius, son of Samuel, a stonecutter from a village who, Josephus says, barely understood what the high priesthood was. They brought him to the city, dressed him in the vestments, and coached him in what to do, like an actor. Josephus finds this the single most disgusting thing in the entire war, and says so. And you have to read his revulsion carefully, because he is a hereditary priest describing the destruction of his own caste. But strip out the class contempt, and something serious is happening. The revolutionaries were not just fighting Rome. They were dismantling the collaborationist establishment that Rome had governed through for a century, and replacing it with something they believed was older and purer. That is a revolution, and revolutions inside sieges do not end well. Ananus, the senior former high priest, raised the population of the city against them, and, in street fighting, drove the Zealots off the outer courts and penned them inside the inner temple. He then made the mistake of putting a guard on the colonnades and waiting rather than storming the sanctuary, because he would not fight inside it. John of Gischala had spent those weeks moving between both camps, swearing loyalty to Ananus while reporting to the Zealots. When the siege of the inner court tightened, he told the Zealots that Ananus had invited Vespasian into the city, and they sent to Idumea for help. 20,000 Idumeans came north and arrived at the walls, and the city refused to open. So they camped outside in the open, and that night one of the great storms of the region broke over Jerusalem. Wind and rain and continuous thunder and lightning of the sort that stops all activity. Under the cover of that noise, a party of zealots came down from the temple, sawed through the bars of a gate, and let the Idumeans in. By morning, 8,500 people were dead in the temple courts and the streets. Ananus was killed and his body was thrown out unburied, which in that city and that culture is a deliberate obscenity. Josephus, who disliked Ananus in life, writes that he believes the capture of the city began the day Ananus died, and that God had condemned the city and cleansed the sanctuary by fire because it had been polluted. That is his editorial and his theology, and it does the convenient work of making the destruction the fault of the Judeans and not of the man who ordered it. What followed was terror. Trials with juries selected and then ignored. Executions of the well-born. Bodies unburied. The Idumeans themselves eventually became disgusted and marched home, which tells you something. And then the city split 3 ways. Simon Bar Giora, who had been building an army in the south out of the dispossessed and the enslaved, whom he freed as a matter of policy, was invited into Jerusalem by the surviving priests and the population, specifically to fight John of Gischala. He came in with tens of thousands and took the upper city and most of the lower. John held the temple platform and the Antonia. And then John's own following split, and Eleazar, son of Simon, took the inner court of the temple with a smaller force, so that there were 3 armies in a city with one enemy on the way, in 3 concentric positions, each shooting at the other 2. They fought inside the sanctuary. Josephus says pilgrims coming to sacrifice were killed by missiles that landed in the courts, and that blood pooled around the altar. The middle group had the height and shot down on the outer burned the buildings around the inner, and the inner shot at anyone who came near. And in the middle of all this, they burned the food. The city had grain stores sufficient, Josephus says, for a siege of years. In the course of the factional fighting, each faction burned the granaries of the others to deny them supply, and the great magazines of Jerusalem went up in fire in the winter and spring before the Romans arrived. Say that plainly, because it is the most important single fact of the siege of 70 AD. The famine that killed more people in Jerusalem than the Roman army did was lit by Judean torches, months before Titus came over the horizon. Vespasian's officers pressed him to attack while the city tore itself apart. His answer, as Josephus reports it, was cold and entirely correct. If he went in now, he would unite them. If he waited, they would spend themselves, and he would take a city that had already beaten itself. So he spent 68 AD methodically taking everything else. Perea, across the Jordan, with a slaughter at the river crossings, Idumea, the coastal region, Jericho, Lydda, and Jamnia. Roads, garrisons, and a ring closing at a walking pace. And somewhere in that campaign season, in the cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, a small community that had lived by its own calendar and its own reading of the law took its library, packed it into jars, and hid it in the caves. The site at Qumran shows a destruction layer with Roman arrowheads and a coin sequence that stops with the war. When the scrolls were found in 1947, the world got the oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible in existence, plus the rulebook of a sect nobody had known existed. Scholars still argue about who exactly hid them and why, but the most likely reading is the simplest one. The Dead Sea Scrolls are refugees from this campaign, packed by people who expected to come back for them. Then, in June of 68, Nero died, and the entire war stopped. A general's authority came from the emperor who appointed him. Vespasian's commission lapsed with Nero's life. He halted operations and waited for instructions from Galba, and Galba was murdered before the instructions arrived. Otho took the throne and killed himself after 3 months. Vitellius took it with the Rhine legions. The empire was eating itself, and no province was watching more attentively than the one with 4 legions parked in it. In July of 69, the legions of Egypt declared for Vespasian, and the legions of Judea and Syria followed within days. And the man Nero had chosen because he was too obscure to be dangerous became a candidate for the throne. He went to Alexandria to sit on the grain supply of the city of Rome, which is a bloodless way of holding a knife to 1 million people. His forces won the war in Italy in his absence. By the end of the year, he was emperor. And the war against Jerusalem passed to his elder son, who now had a personal reason to finish it fast and finish it visibly, because a new dynasty with no ancestors needs a victory that the whole world can see. Titus came south in the spring of 70, with 4 legions, and arrived outside Jerusalem a few days before Passover. How did Rome destroy Jerusalem? Start with the walls, because you cannot follow this siege without them. Jerusalem had 3 walls on its northern side, and effectively 1 everywhere else, because everywhere else was a cliff. To the east, the Kidron Valley; to the south and west, the Valley of Hinnom. The old first wall ran around the upper city on the western hill, and joined the temple platform, and parts of it dated back to the kings of Judah, rebuilt by the Hasmoneans. The second wall enclosed the market quarter north of that. And the third wall, begun by Agrippa I and stopped by Roman order, and then finished in haste when the war began, ran far out to the north around the new suburb of Bezetha. Inside all of that stood two fortresses. On the western hill, Herod's three great towers, Hippicus, Phasael, and Mariamne, built of stone blocks so large that Josephus says they looked as if they had grown out of the ground. And on the northwestern corner of the temple platform, the Antonia, joined to the temple courts by stairways, with a tower at each corner, and one of them 70 cubits high, looking directly down into the sanctuary. And the temple platform itself was the strongest position in the city, a walled enclosure of some 35 acres on retaining walls up to 15 stories high on the southern side, entered through gates that could be held by a handful of men. Now look at the approach. The ravines make an assault from the east or south physically impossible with ancient equipment. Any attack has to come from the north, over the tableland, exactly as Pompey came, exactly as Sosius came. 3 times in this video, an army has arrived at Jerusalem, and 3 times it has camped in the same place, because the ground gives you no other option. Every conqueror of Jerusalem knocks on the same door. Titus brought 4 legions, the 5th Macedonica, and the 10th Fretensis, and the 15th Apollinaris, and the 12th Fulminata, which was brought back specifically so that the legion humiliated at Beth Horon could stand in front of the city that had taken its eagle. Add strong detachments from the Egyptian legions, 20 auxiliary cohorts, 8 cavalry wings, and the contingents of the client kings, and the force is somewhere around 60 to 70,000 men. The chief of staff, the man who actually ran the siege as prefect, was Tiberius Julius Alexander. He was a Jew of Alexandria. He was the son of the richest man in the eastern Mediterranean, an alabarch whose family had donated the gold and silver plating on 9 of the gates of the temple, and he was the nephew of Philo, the greatest Jewish philosopher of the age. He had left the practice of his ancestral religion, entered the Roman service, governed Judea himself, then governed Egypt, and had been the first officer in the empire to proclaim Vespasian emperor. So the siege of the Temple of Jerusalem was directed, day to day, by a man whose own family's money was on the doors. Inside the walls were perhaps 23,000 fighting men, by Josephus's own breakdown. Simon Bar Giora held the upper city, the third wall, and the northern approaches, with around 15,000, including his Idumean allies. John of Gischala held the temple, the Antonia, and the lower city with around 6,000. Eleazar held the inner court with 2,400. And around them was a civilian population swollen far past its normal size, because Titus arrived at Passover, the 1 week of the year when pilgrims from the entire Jewish world are inside the walls. Tacitus says 600,000 people were besieged. Josephus says over 1 million died. Both figures collide with the physical size of the city and with what the surrounding countryside could have fed, and modern estimates of the population run far lower, in the tens of thousands, with an unknown pilgrim surplus. This script is not going to pretend to settle it. What is not disputed is that Jerusalem at Passover held vastly more people than lived there, that almost none of them could get out once the ring closed, and that the food had already been burned. Could the walls hold? Titus almost died before the siege began. He rode forward with 600 cavalry to reconnoiter the northern wall, went along the line toward the women's towers, and a large body of defenders came out of a gate and cut across between him and his own column. He was caught outside, in the open, in ground broken by walls and gardens, with no armor and no shield. He got out by charging along the length of the enemy line with the men still with him, taking blows on the flanks and riding through. Josephus, characteristically, attributes the escape to divine protection of the future emperor. It is at least as likely to be attributable to a good horse. Days later, the 10th Legion was caught mid-entrenchment on the Mount of Olives, spades in hand, and a mass sortie came across the Kidron at them and broke into the camp itself, and the legion started to run. Titus came across with his own guard and held the flank and turned it, twice in one day. The commander of the Roman armies in Judea had come within a spear's length of dying, twice in the first week. And that early violence had one effect nobody wanted. It made the factions inside the city stop fighting each other. The moment the ramps began to rise, John and Simon and Eleazar's men came together into something like a common defense. Josephus is clear that they fought with a unity in the siege that they had never shown before it, and that the sorties against the Roman works were coordinated and savage and repeatedly successful. It is worth stating plainly, because the popular version of this siege is a story of madmen destroying themselves. On the walls, from spring to late summer, against the best army in the world, they fought superbly. The third wall came down in 15 days, at the northwestern angle, after a ram the soldiers had nicknamed the Conqueror finally broke through. The new suburb was taken, and Titus moved his camp inside it. The second wall came down 5 days later. And then Rome lost a round. Titus went in through the breach with 1,000 picked men into the market quarter, which was a maze of narrow lanes, workshops, and the wool and cloth markets. He gave an order that no house was to be burned and no one killed, because he still expected the city to negotiate and did not want to destroy the thing he was trying to acquire. The defenders let him come in, closed on him from the alleys, and counterattacked from all sides. The Roman force was thrown back out through the breach it had entered by, and the defenders held the wall for 4 days. 4 days later it was retaken, and this time Titus pulled the whole northern section of it down and left nothing to fight over. Then he stopped and tried psychology. He suspended operations and held a full pay parade. For 4 days the entire army came out of its camps in full dress, unpacked and polished, and drew its wages by unit, in the open, in view of the walls, with the standards up and the cavalry leading out their horses in decorated harness. Josephus says the whole city crowded onto the walls and the roofs to watch it. The point was not the money. The point was to display, slowly and at length, an unhurried, well-fed, disciplined, enormous army being paid on schedule to people whose granaries had burned. Then he sent negotiators, and the chief negotiator was Josephus, who now had to walk around the wall in range of his own countrymen, in Hebrew, at the top of his voice, telling them to surrender. His speeches from that circuit are in his book, at length, and they are the most self-serving passages in ancient literature. He tells them that God has gone over to the Romans, that resistance to empire is resistance to heaven, that their ancestors won by piety and not by arms. He records that the defenders shouted abuse at him, and that his own mother and father were prisoners inside the city, and that at one point he was hit in the head with a stone and knocked unconscious in front of the wall, and that a rush was made to capture his body, and Titus sent men to save him. Note what has happened to the source. The man narrating the siege of Jerusalem is now a character in it, standing on the Roman side, being cheered by Romans, and writing his own heroic cameo into the record afterwards. Read every line of the next section with that in mind. And behind the walls, the famine took hold. The factions went through the houses looking for hidden stores, and Josephus describes the searchers torturing householders to reveal food, and beating men who had none, on the suspicion that they were concealing it. He describes people chewing leather, belts, sandals, and the straw of old fodder. He describes the roofs and the upper rooms filling with the dying, and the silence of a city too weak to bury its dead, and bodies thrown from the walls into the ravines below until the ravines were full. People began going out at night to forage for roots in the gullies outside the walls, and the Romans caught them, and Titus had them scourged and crucified in front of the wall to break the city's will. Josephus says 500 a day, sometimes more, and that the soldiers, out of hatred and out of boredom, nailed them in different postures for entertainment, and that in the end, there was not room for the crosses, and not enough crosses for the bodies. That figure is his, and it is impossible as a sustained daily rate. But the physical evidence for the scale of the timber operation is not in doubt, because of what the army did to the landscape. To build the ramps and the crosses and the palisades, Roman work parties stripped the hills around Jerusalem of standing timber for miles in every direction. And Josephus says, the country that had been beautiful with trees and gardens was left bare, and that a stranger returning would not have known the place. Show that on the map, as a ring of bare hillside widening around the city week by week. And then the deserters started to be cut open. Some who escaped had swallowed their gold coins to get them past the factions at the gates. A Syrian auxiliary found one picking coins out of his own excrement, and the word went through the camp that the refugees were full of gold. In one night, Josephus says, 2,000 people who had crossed the lines and surrendered were slit open by Syrian and Arab auxiliaries searching their bodies. Titus was enraged when he found out, threatened to have the cavalry surround his own auxiliaries, and issued orders against it, and Josephus admits, in the same passage, that the practice continued in secret. That is a passage that flatters no one, which is one small reason to believe it. And it is in this stretch of the siege that Josephus places the episode that has haunted the account ever since. He reports that a woman named Mary, from a wealthy family east of the Jordan, who had come to the city with her property and been stripped of everything by the factions, killed her infant son, cooked him, ate half, and offered the rest to the men who came to her door demanding food. He says the men fled, and that when the story got out, it went through the whole city and then across the lines into the Roman camp, and that men who had done a great deal of killing themselves were sickened by it. Handle it honestly. Sieges in the ancient world are described again and again, reaching for exactly this image, and it appears in the Hebrew prophets as the sign of a city under final judgment, which means Josephus had a literary template ready and a theological argument to make with it. It may be reportage, it may be the template. What it certainly does is tell you what he wanted his readers to understand about the state of the city by midsummer, and no reader in antiquity would have missed the reference. How do you take a fortress bolted to a temple? The Antonia was the key to the whole position, because from the Antonia you can get into the temple courts. Titus put 4 ramps against it and spent 17 days building them, with the whole army working and timber coming from further away every week. John of Gischala destroyed them in an afternoon. His men had been mining out from under the Antonia, running a tunnel forward beneath the Roman works and shoring it with timber as they went. When the ramps were finished, they filled the tunnel with pitch and bitumen and dry wood and set it alight and pulled out. The props burned through, and the whole excavation collapsed, and the Roman ramps, which had taken 17 days and a forest to build, sank into the ground and were destroyed in the fire underneath them. 2 days later, Simon's men came out against the works on the other side with torches, straight into the artillery, and got in among the engines and fired the rams and the towers before the legions could stop them. And one Roman soldier grabbed the wheel spokes of a burning engine to drag it clear and went down with it. Titus called a council. His army had been in front of the city for months, had lost its siege works twice, was stripping the countryside bare for wood, and the enemy was still coming over the wall to attack it. The answer was the most Roman answer imaginable. He built a wall around the city. The circumvallation ran, by Josephus's measurement, 39 stades, which is somewhere near 5 miles, with 13 forts along it, and the army built it in 3 days. Take that seriously as an engineering fact, because it is the single most intimidating thing the Roman army does in this entire video. 4 legions working in assigned sectors in competition with each other through a continuous fortified wall with garrison posts around a city in 72 hours, using material hauled from up to 10 miles away. It is not the wall that breaks the defenders. It is what the wall means. A besieging army does not need to build one of those unless it intends to be there next year. After the wall, the famine went from severe to absolute. Nobody got out. Nobody foraged. Josephus says the city was full of people dying quietly in their houses, and that the corpses thrown into the ravines were counted in the hundreds of thousands by the men detailed to dispose of them, and that Titus, riding around the perimeter and seeing the valleys full, groaned and lifted his hands, and called God to witness that this was not his doing. You are entitled to your own view of that scene, and of who was in a position to hear it and write it down. New ramps went up against the Antonia. The timber came from 10 miles out, and then, on a night when the works were nearly ready, an auxiliary soldier named Sabinus from Syria decided to go up on his own. Josephus describes him with a curious tenderness. Black-skinned, he says, and thin and slight, and not much to look at, so that no one would have guessed what was in him. Sabinus took his shield over his head and went up the sloping rubble under the wall with 11 men following, alone in front. He reached the top. The defenders, seeing one man arrive, scattered from the parapet, and for a moment the Antonia was open. Then he stepped on a loose stone and fell forward onto his face with a crash of armor. They turned and came back and surrounded him, and he fought from his knees with his shield over him until they killed him. 3 of the 11 were killed on the rubble, and the rest were dragged out wounded. 2 nights later, 20 men did it properly, and did it quietly. A standard-bearer of the 5th Legion, 2 cavalrymen, and a trumpeter, and a party of soldiers went up in the small hours, cut the throats of the sleeping sentries, and then the trumpeter sounded. That is the whole trick. In the dark, on a wall, a Roman trumpet call from a position that is supposed to be yours means the fortress has fallen. John's men abandoned the outer works and fell back into the temple, believing an army was already inside, and Titus put his troops in through the gap. And here is the detail that makes the fall of the Antonia the turning point of the entire siege. The Romans got up onto the walls, in part by climbing the ruins that John's own countermine had created. The tunnel he had dug to destroy the ramps had collapsed the ground and left a slope of rubble against the fortress, and the assault party used it as a staircase. 10 hours of fighting followed at the junction between the Antonia and the temple courts, in a corridor where numbers were useless. Josephus, watching from the Roman side, records the death of a centurion named Julianus from Bithynia, whom he calls the finest soldier he ever saw. Julianus came forward alone when a Roman party was being pushed back, drove the defenders the length of the court on his own, and then, on the smooth flagstones of the temple pavement, his hobnailed boots lost their grip, and he went down flat on his back, in his armor with a clang. They came back onto him in a mass. He fought lying on the ground, on his side, under his shield, killing men from underneath, for as long as it took them to get through his armor with their spears, and Titus stood watching and could not reach him. That is what the last defense of the temple looked like from 30 feet away. Titus raised the Antonia to the ground and used the material to build a broad ramp up to the platform, wide enough to bring the whole army in, and in the middle of that work, the sacrifice stopped. The daily offering, morning and evening, had been made in that place without interruption for as long as anyone could count, through Pompey's siege, through Sosius, through Crassus, through the factions killing each other in the courts. In the summer of 70, the priests reported that there were no men left with the strength to perform it, and no animals. Tradition places the failure on the 17th day of the month of Tammuz. For the first time in centuries, in the middle of the war being fought to protect it, the house was silent. Who burned the temple? Titus held a council of war about the sanctuary itself, and this is the single most contested passage in the history of the war, because we have 2 accounts and they say opposite things. Josephus says that some officers wanted it destroyed as a permanent focus of rebellion, and that Titus overruled them, arguing that a building should not be punished for the men in it, and that the temple would be an ornament to the empire if it were preserved. In Josephus, Titus votes to save it. But there is a fragment in the Christian chronicler Sulpicius Severus, writing 3 centuries later, which most scholars believe preserves the lost account of Tacitus. In that version, Titus argues in council that the temple must be destroyed precisely in order to root out the religions of the Jews and the Christians, which grow from the same stock, and that if the root is pulled up, the stem will die. So take the 2 sources and weigh them. Josephus was a client of the Flavian house, writing under Titus, with his book approved by Titus, and he had every reason on earth to place the destruction of the sanctuary at the feet of the men inside it and of God, and none at all in the emperor's hands. Tacitus was writing a generation later, was hostile to the Judeans as a people, and had no motive to invent restraint or its opposite. The Sulpicius fragment is not certainly Tacitus, and Tacitus was not in the room either. Both accounts pass through men with agendas. What we can say is that the version universally repeated afterwards, in which a reluctant Titus tried desperately to save the temple, comes to us from the man on his payroll. The fighting for the platform began with a trap, and the trap was fire. The defenders packed the roof of the western colonnade with dry timber and bitumen and pitch, and then pulled back from it as if in panic. Roman soldiers went up onto the roof in a rush, hundreds of them, and the defenders lit it under their feet. The whole portico went up at once, a ring of flame running the length of the court with men on top of it. Some jumped down into the court and were killed. Some jumped outward off the outer wall and did not survive the drop. Josephus, who tells 3 separate small stories from that roof, mentions a soldier named Longus who was called on by the defenders to surrender and given promises, and who killed himself in front of both armies rather than take them, and another who jumped and landed on a comrade and lived. The rams then went to work on the temple wall itself and got nowhere for 6 days, because the stones of Herod's platform are among the largest ever set by human beings, and the joints are so tight that a ram delivers its energy into a mountain. So they came at the gates. The great gates of the court were plated in gold and silver over wood, and the Romans piled material against them and set fire to it, and the metal on the doors melted and ran. And the fire went into the woodwork and through the gates, and then into the colonnades on either side, and burned along them for 2 days. That brought them into the outer court, and on the 9th and 10th day of the month of Av, the sanctuary burned. Note the date, because tradition holds that the first temple, destroyed by Babylon more than 600 years earlier, fell on the same day of the same month. And Josephus points at the coincidence with both hands. Dates in ancient sources have a habit of migrating toward the anniversaries that make them meaningful, and you should keep that in mind here and at Betar. Josephus's account of the fire is precise and strange. He says Titus had given orders that the sanctuary was not to be burned, and had withdrawn to rest, and that in a skirmish at the gates, a Roman soldier, without orders, moved, as he puts it, by some supernatural impulse, took a burning brand, was lifted up by another soldier, and threw it through the golden window that opened into the chambers on the north side. Fire inside the house. He then says a runner brought the news to Titus, who came at speed, shouting at the troops to put it out, and that in the noise and the crush, his voice could not be heard, or was not heeded, and his signals were ignored. And the legionaries, half from rage and half from the certain knowledge that there was gold in there, threw more fire in and forced the doors. Every element of that scene protects one man. Hold that thought and watch what happens next in the same account, because Josephus also tells us that Roman soldiers planted their standards in the temple court and sacrificed to them opposite the eastern gate, and hailed Titus as imperator on the holy ground while the sanctuary burned behind them. An army that was frantically trying to save a building does not stop to hold a religious ceremony in front of it. The killing in the courts was general. Josephus says the steps were slippery and the bodies of the dead were carried down by the flow. 6,000 people, including women and children, had been driven up onto the roof of the last remaining portico of the outer court by a prophet who had announced that day that God commanded them to go up to the temple to receive the signs of their deliverance. The soldiers fired the portico underneath them, and nobody came down alive. Josephus adds, in one of the few passages where his bitterness is aimed at his own side, that the factions had been employing false prophets throughout the siege to keep the population from surrendering, and that the ruin of the people was the work of men who told them help was coming. The gold that had been on the gates and the plating had run and pooled and gone into the joints of the stonework in the heat, and afterwards Roman soldiers came back and prized the blocks apart to get at it, which is one entirely mundane explanation for a city left with not one stone standing on another. The objects that mattered survived, and we know they survived because we can see where they went. 2 priests and the temple treasurer came out under terms and bought their lives with the sanctuary's remaining furniture, the lampstand, the table of the showbread, the vessels, and the veils, and the priestly garments. Those went to Rome. Why did the strongest fortress in the city fall without a fight? After the temple burned, John and Simon still held the upper city on the western hill, behind the first wall, with Herod's 3 towers in it. They asked to parley. Titus came to the bridge over the central valley and offered them their lives if they laid down their arms. They asked instead to be allowed to walk out through the Roman lines into the desert with their wives and children. Titus, who had offered terms repeatedly for 5 months and had been shot at every time, ended the negotiation and gave the army the city. It took 18 days to build the ramps against the western hill. The rams went in and made a breach in the wall. And then the defenders abandoned Herod's towers. The 3 towers were the strongest works in Jerusalem. Josephus says flatly that no engine could have taken them, and he is very probably right because they were solid masonry of enormous blocks and they had their own water. The Romans came over the breach expecting the hardest fight of the siege and found the towers empty, the garrison gone down into the tunnels and the sewers under the city. Josephus can only explain it as madness sent from God. The likelier explanation is that after 5 months of famine and the loss of the temple, the will to fight simply ran out in one afternoon, and everybody discovered it at the same moment. Josephus notes that when Titus later saw the towers up close, he said that God had clearly been on the Roman side, since no human power could have taken those. The sack ran through the upper city and then out through the streets, and the killing continued until the soldiers were tired, at which point the survivors became inventory. Josephus says the total taken prisoner across the whole war was 97,000, and the dead in the siege 1,100,000, and that number is impossible for the city's size, and is best understood as a way of saying beyond counting. Tacitus's 600,000 besieged is lower, and still very high. The honest position is that we do not know, and that the true figures were catastrophic by any standard. They went into the ground in the same weeks. Excavations in the Jewish quarter of the Old City have exposed a house of the priestly Cathros family, burned in the destruction layer of 70 AD. In the kitchen there were stone weights, inscribed with the family name, cooking vessels, a spear leaning against a wall, and on the threshold, the bones of a woman's forearm and hand, reaching. It is called the burnt house. It is one room of one house on one street, and it is what the numbers actually consist of. The last act took place underground. The fighters who had gone down into the drains and sewers under the city were hunted out over the following weeks, and Josephus says 2,000 bodies were found in the tunnels, some killed by each other, some starved. John of Gischala came up starving and surrendered, and was sentenced to life imprisonment. And Simon Bar Giora, who had held the upper city and had gone underground with a party of stonecutters intending to dig his way out beyond the Roman lines, ran out of provisions and staged the last performance of the war. He put on a white tunic and a purple cloak, and he came up out of the ground on the exact spot where the temple had stood, in front of the Roman sentries posted in the ruins. The guards were badly frightened, called their officer, and asked him who he was, and he refused to answer any of them, and asked for the commander. They put him in chains. It was a calculated act. A man in purple rising out of the earth at the site of the sanctuary is a claim, and the Romans understood it as one, and it bought him exactly what a defeated enemy commander of that stature gets. He was reserved for the triumph. Jerusalem was pulled down. Titus ordered the whole city and the whole circuit of the walls demolished, with 3 exceptions. Herod's 3 towers were left standing, and a stretch of the western wall of the city was left with them, to serve as a fortified camp for the garrison. Josephus says the towers were preserved to show later generations what kind of city and how well defended Roman valor had subdued. The garrison left in the ruins was the 10th Legion Fretensis, and it stayed there for over 200 years. You will sometimes hear that the Romans plowed the site and sowed it with salt. There is no ancient source for that. Nobody salted Jerusalem in the same way that nobody salted Carthage, which is a legend of much more recent vintage. The truth is drier and worse. Nobody needed to sterilize the ground. There was a legionary camp on it, an imperial estate around it, and no city to come back to. The turning point of the siege of 70 AD is the fall of the Antonia, and specifically the fact that the Romans climbed into it up the rubble that John of Gischala's own tunnel had created. The most successful piece of defensive engineering in the whole siege built the staircase that lost it. And the reason the defenders lost is not courage, because they fought harder than anyone Rome faced that century. They lost because there were 3 armies inside one wall for 2 years, because those 3 armies burned the food supply that would have outlasted any Roman timetable. Because the city was packed by a festival at the exact moment the ring closed, and because their enemy could build a 5-mile fortification in 3 days and did not have to be anywhere else. What does Rome do with a captured god? It puts him in a parade. The triumph of 71 AD was held for Vespasian and Titus together, and Josephus stood in the crowd and watched it, which makes his description of it the best eyewitness account of a Roman triumph that exists. The spoils came through the streets in such quantity that he says it was impossible to take them in. Silver and gold and ivory carried loose, embroidered Babylonian tapestries, gems in crowns, and animals in ornamented harness. And moving among them were the pageant wagons, stages built 3 and 4 stories high, draped in gold and covered in ivory, each one carrying a tableau of the war. Josephus says the spectators could see a prosperous country being overrun, whole formations of men being killed, walls thrown down by engines, fortresses stormed, cities with the defenders on the ramparts and the enemy inside, temples on fire, houses collapsing on their owners, and rivers running through burnt country. And on each stage, at the top, stood a model of the commander of the place, as he had been when it was taken. The war was 3 years old, and Rome had already turned it into moving scenery. Behind the wagons came the objects, and these are the ones that matter. The golden table of weight, the lampstand, its central shaft, and its branches. And last, carried at the end, as the culmination of the spoils, the law of the Jewish people. 700 selected prisoners walked in front of them, chosen for height and physique, dressed to look their best, which is what a triumph does with human beings. And at the appointed point, the procession halted at the forum, because the ritual requires that the enemy commander be executed at the end of the route, and that the sacrifices cannot begin until the news of his death is announced. Simon Bar Giora was dragged along with a rope around his neck, scourged by his escort as he went, taken to the spot beside the forum, and killed there. Word came back that he was dead, the crowd shouted, and the sacrifices began, and afterwards the emperor went home to dinner. John of Gischala got life in prison. Simon got the rope. The difference is that Simon had put on purple in the ruins, and Rome had noticed. And then the proceeds went to work, in stone, in a way you can still walk around. Vespasian built the Temple of Peace in Rome, one of the most admired buildings in the city, to house the spoils, and the golden vessels of the temple were deposited in it as public exhibits. And there is the Colosseum. Its dedicatory inscription was later reused, and the original text was reconstructed by the historian Geza Alfoldi from the pattern of holes left by the bronze letters that had been prized out. Flag that as a scholarly reconstruction rather than a surviving inscription. The reading is that the emperor ordered the new amphitheater to be built from the general's share of the spoils of war, and given the date and the only war available. That means the Flavian amphitheater was paid for out of Judea. The most famous building of the Roman Empire was funded by the destruction of Jerusalem, and, in significant part, built by the people who were enslaved in it. The Arch of Titus was raised on the sacred way after his death, under his brother Domitian. On its inner panel, the lampstand and the table and the trumpets are carried by men with wreaths, tilted at an angle to show the depth of the relief. It is the only surviving image of the temple furniture made by anyone who might have seen it. Recent examination of the surface using imaging techniques found traces of pigment on the relief, including yellow ochre on the arms of the lampstand, which means that the panel was painted, and that for the first generation of Romans who walked under that arch, the lampstand on the wall was gold. And then there was the tax. Every Jewish man in the empire had paid a half shekel a year to the temple in Jerusalem. The temple no longer existed, and Vespasian did not abolish the payment. He redirected it. The same sum, now the Fiscus Judaicus, was to be paid by every Jew in the empire, including women and children and the elderly, to the treasury of Jupiter Capitolinus in Rome, for the upkeep of the temple of the god in whose house Herod had deposited his kingship 100 years before. It is one of the most elegant humiliations in the history of taxation. The money that had maintained the house was now maintaining the god that replaced it, and it arrived every year from every province with a receipt Under Domitian, the collection became notorious for its harshness, and Suetonius says he saw an old man in a crowded court stripped in front of the procurator to determine whether he was liable. Conquest number 3 was now complete everywhere except in the desert, where 3 of Herod's fortresses were still flying the flag of a state that no longer existed. The mopping up fell to Lucilius Bassus, and then to Flavius Silva. Herodium, the artificial mountain south of Jerusalem, surrendered quickly and without a recorded fight, which is the last thing you would expect from a fortress built by a paranoid king to be impregnable, and the first sign that the war had gone out of the country. Machaerus did not. The fortress sits on an isolated cone on the heights east of the Dead Sea, with ravines around it on 3 sides and a view across the water into Judea, and Herod had walled the summit and built towers on it and cut cisterns into the rock. Bassus arrived, examined it, and understood immediately that the only feasible approach was to fill in the ravine on the eastern side and build up to the level of the wall, which was going to take months. The siege was decided by a hostage. There was a young man among the defenders named Eleazar, who was bold and popular, and who made a habit of coming out in front of the gate to skirmish and to show off. A Roman soldier named Rufus came out of the works at a run one day, caught him in the open, picked him up bodily in his armor, and carried him back to the Roman lines, while both sides watched. Bassus then had him stripped, brought out in view of the entire wall, and scourged. And then he had a cross set up. The garrison broke. The young man called out to his own people to save him, and the wall watched a boy they all knew being prepared for crucifixion. And they sent to negotiate the surrender of the fortress in exchange for his life and safe passage. Bassus accepted, and he honored it. The garrison of the citadel walked out, and the young man lived. And then the people of the lower town, who had not been party to the agreement, found the Romans in possession, and 1,700 men were killed, and the women and children were enslaved. That is Roman good faith, working exactly as designed. The terms were kept to the letter, and everyone outside the letter died. Anyone in that country, watching from a distance, would have drawn the obvious conclusion about what a Roman guarantee was worth, and would have taken it into account when deciding whether to surrender a rock in the desert. Did the defenders of Masada really kill themselves? This is the most famous story of the entire war. It is the least verifiable, and the honest version is more interesting than the legend. Start with the rock. Masada is an isolated plateau standing over 400 meters above the western shore of the Dead Sea, with vertical cliffs on every side and only 2 paths up. One of them, a snake track, on the eastern face that switchbacks so tightly that a file of men can be held on it by a handful. Herod had walled the entire rim with a casemate wall containing chambers, built 2 palaces, including the one hanging down the northern point in 3 terraces, and cut 12 enormous cisterns into the northwestern slope, fed by aqueducts from dams in the wadis, so that a fortress in one of the driest places on earth held millions of liters of water. And around the base of it, still visible today and one of the best preserved siege systems anywhere in the world, is what Rome did about it. 8 camps, laid out in the standard pattern with their gates and streets and tent lines still legible on the desert floor. A circumvallation wall running around the entire mountain, several miles of it, with towers. And on the western side, running up to the wall, the ramp. Before any of the heroism, one fact has to go on the record, because it is in Josephus, and it is routinely left out. The people on Masada were Sicarii, the dagger men, under Eleazar ben Yair. They had taken the rock by surprise at the start of the war and killed its Roman garrison. They did not participate in the defense of Jerusalem. And Josephus reports that during the war they came down off the mountain at night to raid for supplies, and that at Passover they descended on the village of Ein Gedi, a Jewish settlement on the same shore, drove out the men who could fight, and killed 700 women and children. That is the group on the mountain. Whatever Masada means, it does not mean anything simple. Flavius Silva came in 73 or 74 AD, and the date is genuinely disputed and hangs on the reconstruction of Silva's career from inscriptions, so treat any confident date with suspicion. He brought the 10th Legion Fretensis, auxiliaries, and thousands of Jewish prisoners of war, and the prisoners are the reason the siege was possible at all, because the real enemy at Masada was logistics. There is no water, and no food, and no wood in that landscape. Every drop the besieging army drank, and every beam it used, had to be brought in on pack animals across the desert, and it had to arrive every day, for months, for an army of thousands. Show the supply columns on the map, because they are the siege. The fighting is an afterthought. Silva built the ring wall so that nobody could slip out, and then he went at the western side, where a natural spur of rock projects toward the plateau and reduces the height that has to be climbed. And here a modern correction belongs, because the legend has run away with this. The story people tell is that the Roman army built a mountain out of nothing. Geological and engineering studies of the ramp indicate that the great bulk of it is a natural rock spur that was already there, and that the Roman contribution was the upper surface, packed fill and timber bracing to turn a steep natural slope into a graded roadway capable of carrying a siege tower. That is still an astounding piece of work in that heat with imported timber. It is not the impossible feat of the storybook, and the difference matters, because the storybook version quietly implies that Rome could do anything, when what Rome actually did was look at the ground very carefully and find the one place where the mountain was already half-beaten. The tower went up the ramp plated in iron, with artillery on it to clear the wall, and a ram behind it. The casemate wall broke, and behind it there was another wall, and it was the cleverest defensive work of the war. Eleazar's people had built a second wall out of two parallel rows of timber packed with earth between them. When the ram struck a stone wall, the shock ran through the structure and cracked it. When the ram struck this one, the blow drove the earth fill tighter and made the wall denser. Every stroke made it stronger. It is a genuinely brilliant piece of improvised engineering, and it is the exact principle behind why earthworks outlast masonry under bombardment. The Romans stopped hitting it and set fire to it instead, because the frames were wood. Then the wind, which Josephus turns into theology, and which you can decide about for yourself. He says the wind first blew from the north, driving the flames back into the Roman works and threatening to burn the siege tower, and that the Romans despaired. And then the wind swung round to the south and took the fire straight into the wall, and the whole structure burned through. The breach was opened by evening. The assault was set for dawn, and the Romans went back down to their camps for the night because nobody was going anywhere off that rock in the dark. What happened on the mountain that night comes to us through one source, and that source was not there, and neither was any Roman. Josephus says Eleazar ben Yair assembled the men and made a speech, and when it did not convince them, made a second one. He argued that they had resolved long ago to serve neither the Romans nor anyone but God, that the choice now was between a death of their own choosing and slavery, torture, and the certainty that their wives would be raped and their children enslaved, and that the soul is imprisoned in the body and is freed by death. He used in the second speech an argument drawn from Indian philosophy and a set of ideas about the immortality of the soul that would be at home in a Greek philosophical treatise. Say the obvious thing here. These speeches are compositions. Josephus was in Rome. The Romans on the mountain the next morning found no one alive to interview, except the survivors he mentions, and the words are exactly the kind of high Greek rhetoric that an educated author writes for a doomed hero. In the tradition of every set speech in ancient historiography, nobody wrote this down on Masada. The account then says that the men killed their own families, that 10 men were chosen by lot to kill the rest, that one of the 10 was chosen by lot to kill the other 9, and that the last man checked the bodies, set fire to the palace, and killed himself. 960 people, 2 women, and 5 children, who had hidden in a water conduit, survived, and came out in the morning and told the Romans. At dawn the legion came up over the ramp, through the burnt wall, expecting a fight, and walked into silence. Now the archaeology, because Masada has been excavated more thoroughly than almost any site in the country. Yiga El Yadin's excavations in the 1960s found the fortress full of the war, living quarters built into the casemate wall, cooking installations, stores, coins of the revolt, and a room that appears to have been used as a place of assembly and study. There were scroll fragments, including biblical texts and a copy of a work otherwise known only from the Dead Sea caves, which links the people on the rock to the wider world of sectarian Judaism in some way that is still argued about. And there were 11 small inscribed potsherds, found together, each bearing a single name. One of them reads Ben Yair. Yaden proposed that these were the lots used by the last 10 men. It is a beautiful suggestion, and it might be right. It is also true that ostraca with names on them were used at Masada for rationing and duty rosters, and that 11 sherds is not 10. Then the bodies. 960 people died on that mountain, according to Josephus. The excavations recovered the remains of about 28 individuals in total. 3 in the northern palace, including a young woman whose braided hair was preserved by the dry air, along with a man's armor scales and arrows. And around 25 more in a cave below the southern cliff, whose connection to the last night is disputed, partly because pig bones were found in the same deposit, which is difficult to reconcile with a Jewish burial, and has led some scholars to suggest the cave held Roman dead, or a much later interment. 28 is not 960. It is possible that the Romans disposed of the rest in a way that left no trace, or that they lie somewhere unexcavated, or that the number was never real. Where does that leave us? The scholarship has settled into a sober middle. Shea Cohen and others have gone through the narrative and shown how much of it is Josephus doing what Josephus does, composing speeches, arranging a scene for maximum moral effect, and reconciling his own survival with his admiration for people who did not survive. Jody Magnus, who has worked on the site, holds the reasonable position that something did happen on that mountain, that the burnt layer and the abandonment are real, and that a decision by the defenders to die rather than be taken is entirely plausible for that group in that place, while the theatrical unanimity of the account, the lots, the speeches, the exact figure, belongs to the historian, and not to the knight. And there is one more thing worth saying, briefly. For roughly 18 centuries after this, almost nobody talked about Masada. It was a ruin in a desert, mentioned in one Greek book that the Jewish tradition did not read. It became famous only in the modern era, when it was excavated, and the story of the last stand was recovered and became a symbol. A place can be forgotten for 1800 years, and then become the most quoted event in its own war, and that is a fact about memory, rather than a fact about the first century. The turning point at Masada was the wind, whichever way you think the wind was sent. And the reason the defenders lost is that they were in the most defensible position in the ancient world, in a landscape where nobody could relieve them, opposite an enemy that was willing to spend a year hauling water across a desert in order to build a road up a cliff. There was never a version of that siege that ended differently. The only thing the defenders controlled was the ending. By the mid-70s, the third conquest was complete, and Rome minted the announcement. The coins went out across the empire, in gold, silver, and bronze, and there were more of them, struck over a longer period than for any other victory of the era. On the reverse stood a palm tree, and under it a Roman soldier with a spear, and on the other side of the trunk a woman sitting on the ground with her head in her hand. The legend read, "Judea captured." Rome told the world it was over. The world found out 60 years later that it was not. What do you do when the center of your religion has been destroyed, and the law requires it? That question had to be answered in the years immediately after 70, and the answer is the reason there was anybody left to fight the Fourth War. Jewish tradition tells it as a story. Rabban Yohanan ben Zakkai, trapped in besieged Jerusalem and opposed to the war, had himself carried out through the gates in a coffin, because the factions would let a corpse leave and nothing else, was taken to the Roman camp, and there greeted Vespasian as emperor before he was one. Vespasian, impressed, offered him a request, and he asked for a small coastal town and its scholars. Treat that as legend, because it is one. It appears in rabbinic sources compiled generations later. It borrows the prophecy motif that Josephus had already attached to himself, and its details vary between versions. What is not legend is the outcome. At Yavne on the coast, a rabbinic academy became the surviving institution of Judean religious life, and over the following decades, the entire structure of the religion was rebuilt on foundations that did not require a building. Prayer and study and legal argument replaced sacrifice. The calendar was fixed by a council rather than by the priests of a single site. The tradition became portable. Rome had destroyed a temple, which is the sort of thing Rome knew how to do. It had not noticed that it was dealing with something that could survive not having one. Meanwhile, the diaspora went up. In 115 AD, while Trajan was deep inside Parthian territory with the eastern armies committed, the Jewish communities of Cyrenaica, Egypt, Cyprus, and Mesopotamia rose almost simultaneously. This is the Kitos War, and it is the least known of the four, and in some ways the most frightening, because it happened behind the imperial front line. In provinces the army had stripped of troops. Cassius Dio's account is a catalogue of atrocity, with rebels in Cyrene eating flesh and wearing skins and cutting people in half. Read that for what it is, which is wartime propaganda about an internal enemy of the sort every empire produces. What is not propaganda is the physical evidence. Cyrene's temples and roads were wrecked, and the city had to be repopulated by imperial order. Egyptian papyri from the period are full of terrified private letters. In Alexandria and across the Egyptian countryside, the ancient Jewish community was effectively destroyed. On Cyprus, the community was wiped out, and Jews were subsequently barred from the island. The killing ran hard in both directions, and it ended one of the great centers of Jewish life in the ancient world. Trajan sent his Moorish cavalry general Lucius Quietus to clear Mesopotamia, and he did, and was then made governor of Judea, which tells you that Rome thought Judea was next. Judea did not rise, not yet. Trajan died in 117. His successor gave up the eastern conquests, executed several leading senators including Quietus, and settled down to a reign of consolidation, culture, and travel. He was the most cosmopolitan emperor Rome ever had, a builder, a Hellenist, a man who loved Greek cities and endowed them everywhere he went. And in about 130 AD, on his tour of the East, Hadrian arrived at the ruins of Jerusalem and decided to do it a favor. Look at Judea, around 130 AD. Where Jerusalem was, there is a legionary camp and a plan. Hadrian has ordered the site refounded as a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina, from his own family name and from Jupiter Capitolinus, laid out on the standard grid with a forum and with temples in it. To the north, a second legion has been permanently stationed in the country, the 6th Ferrata, at Legio near Megiddo, which means the province now carries 2 legions where it once carried none. And now the layer that matters. Look at the Judean foothills, the low hills between the coastal plain and the mountains, an area of soft chalk and limestone and dense villages. Under those villages, in the years before the war, people were digging, not cellars, networks. Chambers connected by crawlways, with water storage and air shafts, and concealed entrances inside ordinary houses, and in some cases, links between one village complex and the next. Show them as pinpricks of darkness spreading under the map, because that is the 4th war. Everything Rome is about to fight is underneath. 60 years have passed since the temple burned. The people who saw it are old. Their grandchildren are the fighting generation, and they have grown up on a story about a house that is not there. What made Judea rise one last time? We have 2 ancient explanations, and they do not agree, and both come with problems. Cassius Dio says the cause was the foundation of Aelia Capitolina. Hadrian founded a city on the site of Jerusalem, put a temple to Jupiter where the temple had stood, and this, Dio says, brought on a war of no small importance, because the Jews could not tolerate foreigners settled in their city, and foreign rights planted in it. Note that we read Dio through a Byzantine abridgment made by the monk Ixiphilinus 1,000 years later, so we are reading a summary of a summary. The Historia Augusta says the cause was a ban on circumcision, which the Jews took up arms to resist. And here, the standing rule applies. The Historia Augusta is a late collection of imperial biographies, riddled with invented sources, fabricated documents, and outright fiction, and it is the least reliable major source in Roman history. When it says something that no other source says, it does not get the benefit of the doubt. There probably was a legal restriction on circumcision at some point in this period, since Hadrian issued a general ban on castration, and it is plausible that circumcision was drawn into it by an administrator who saw a similar operation. But whether that came before the war as a cause or after it as a punishment is genuinely unresolved, and honest historians say so. Roman legal sources show a later emperor permitting Jews to circumcise their own sons while forbidding it to others, which implies a ban had existed but does not date it. The likeliest answer is that both mattered and neither was sufficient. 60 years of a province with no temple, a tax paid to Jupiter for the privilege of being conquered, and a legion camped in the ruins of the holy city is a stable arrangement only if nobody proposes to build anything on the site. Hadrian proposed to build a Greek city on it, with a temple, and named it after himself. And they had a leader. His name, and we know it now with certainty, was Shimon ben Kokhba. We know it because in the 1960s, his own letters were found in a cave in the Judean desert, signed and dated in the hand of his secretaries. But almost nobody called him that. To his supporters he was Bar Kokhba, son of the star. And the name is a claim, taken from the prophecy in the book of Numbers, that a star shall come out of Jacob. Rabbinic tradition says that Rabbi Akiba, the greatest legal scholar of the age, applied that verse to him in public and called him the King Messiah, and that another rabbi answered that grass would grow out of Akiba's cheekbones before the son of David came. And to later rabbinic tradition, after the catastrophe, he was Bar Kokhba, son of the lie. One man, 3 names, and the war of the names is the war itself. He is the star, the man, or the lie, depending entirely on which decade you are standing in. What is clear is that the rising was prepared, patiently, over years. Dio describes 2 preparations, and archaeology has confirmed both. The first is that Judeans working under Roman contract to supply weapons deliberately made them badly, so that the arms would be rejected, and then collected the rejected weapons for themselves. The second is the underground systems. They dug, he says, subterranean passages and chambers, with shafts pierced to the surface for air and light. More than 350 of those hideout complexes have now been mapped in the Judean lowlands, cut under village houses, with crawl tunnels deliberately narrowed so that a man has to enter bent double and one at a time, with sharp turns, with rooms opening off them, with water cisterns and storage. Several contain coins of the revolt. They were built for this war, and they were built before it started. An ancient historian describing something that was verified 1800 years later by a survey team is a good day for ancient history, and it means Dio's account of the fighting should be taken seriously even where his numbers cannot be. The rising began in 132, and it waited, sensibly, until Hadrian had left the region. How badly did Rome bleed? Badly enough that the emperor came back. The rebels took the countryside, and then they did something no insurgency in the Roman Empire had done. They ran a state. They struck coins, and the way they struck them is a statement in itself. They took Roman coins, including coins with the emperor's portrait, and overstruck them with their own dies, hammering new images over the old, so that on many surviving examples, you can still see traces of the Roman design underneath. The new legends read, Year 1 of the redemption of Israel, and Year 2 of the freedom of Israel, and, on many, for the freedom of Jerusalem. The imagery is the temple facade, the lyre, the palm branch, the wine jar. Show that on screen, the freedom of a country, hammered directly over the face of the emperor it was fighting. And there is administration. Land lease documents survive, on papyrus, in which the leasing authority is Shimon ben Kokhba, Prince of Israel, and his officials assign fields and collect rents in the middle of a war. Contracts were dated by the years of the redemption. Somebody was running a treasury. Did they take Jerusalem? The coins say the freedom of Jerusalem. The traditional account has the rebels holding the city and even beginning to rebuild the temple, and modern scholarship has largely moved away from that, for 2 reasons. There is no destruction or conquest layer of the right date in the excavated parts of Aelia, and the rebel coins have not turned up in Jerusalem in the quantities you would expect if the city had been held and administered for 3 years. Some scholars still argue for a brief capture. Most now think the slogan was a war aim rather than a report. That is an honest disagreement, and it should be presented as one, because it changes the shape of the war. If they never took Jerusalem, then the entire rebellion was fought in the countryside, from the tunnels, for a city they could see and never entered. Roman losses were severe. The governor Tineius Rufus was overwhelmed and lost control of the province. The 10th Legion Fortenses, the garrison of Jerusalem, was mauled, and its own tile stamps and the coin evidence suggest serious disruption. And somewhere in this period, the 22nd Legion Diotariana disappears. It was stationed in Egypt. It appears in the army lists in the early 2nd century, and it is gone from them afterwards, and no source records what happened. The candidates are that it was destroyed in this war, that it was destroyed in the Kitos War in Egypt, or that it was disbanded for some disgrace we know nothing about. There is no consensus, and there is no evidence that settles it. A minority of scholars have also tried to place the disappearance of the 9th Legion Hispana in this war rather than in Britain, and that is a possibility with even less to support it. What we can say is that a legion vanished from the Roman order of battle in this period and nobody wrote down why, which in itself tells you something about how badly Rome wanted this war discussed. Then Hadrian did the thing that measures the scale of the crisis. He sent for Sextus Julius Severus, and he sent to Britain to get him. Understand what that means logistically and politically. The governor of Britain was the man commanding the most difficult military province in the empire, at the far end of the world from Judea, and it took months for the summons to reach him, and months more for him to arrive. Rome did not do that for a provincial disturbance. Rome did that because the situation required the best field commander in the empire, and was going to keep requiring him for years. Troops were pulled in from everywhere. Inscriptions, career records of individual officers, and military diplomas point to detachments drawn from legions across the empire, from Syria, Arabia, Egypt, the Danube, and beyond. And the historian Werner Eck has argued from the epigraphic evidence for a very large concentration, on the order of a dozen legions, represented in whole or in part. Other scholars read the same evidence more conservatively and argue for something smaller. The range is genuine. But even the conservative reading describes the largest military concentration in the Eastern Empire since the Great Revolt, for a province with no coastline of consequence, no strategic frontier, and no wealth left in it. Hadrian himself came to the theater for part of the war, and Dio preserves one detail that is worth more than any casualty figure. When the emperor wrote to the Senate about the progress of the war, he omitted the customary opening formula, the sentence with which every imperial dispatch began, that if you and your children are well, it is well, and that the emperor and the legions are well. He left it out because it was not true. The commander-in-chief of the Roman Empire could not tell the Senate that his armies were in good health, so he removed the sentence rather than lie in a public document. How do you fight a war with no battles? Julius Severus arrived and looked at the situation and made the decision that won the war, and that makes this the strangest campaign in this video. He refused to fight. Dio states the doctrine plainly. Severus did not venture to attack the enemy in the open at any point, considering their numbers and their desperation. Instead, he took them in separate groups, cut off their food supplies, shut them in, and reduced them, slowly, position by position, and in this way, he crushed them with fewer casualties to his own men, and with no risk of another Beth Horon. That is counterinsurgency, described in the 2nd century, and it is why there is no great battle of this war. There is no field where the fate of Judea was decided. There is a 4-year process of sealing districts, burning crops, blocking wells, and working through a landscape one village at a time. So, the set piece of the 4th conquest is not a battle line. It is a hole in the ground, and what follows is a reconstruction built from Dio's description and from the excavated complexes themselves. And the script is telling you plainly that it is a reconstruction, because nobody narrated one of these fights. Picture the village above. an ordinary Judean farming settlement of stone houses and courtyards and olive presses on the chalk hills, no wall, nothing to besiege. Under one of the houses, beneath a slab in the floor of a storeroom, there is a shaft. It drops into a crawlway cut through soft rock, and the crawlway is deliberately made too small. A man has to go in on hands and knees, in single file, without a shield, pushing his weapons ahead of him. It turns sharply after a few meters, and again, and each turn is a place where a man arriving cannot see and cannot swing and cannot bring a second man alongside him. Then it opens into a chamber where the defenders can stand up, and where there is water in a plastered cistern, and grain in jars, and more passages leading off into the dark. Now bring in the Romans. Everything that makes a legionary lethal is gone. The formation is gone. The shield is useless in a tunnel a meter wide. The pilum cannot be thrown. Armor makes him slower in a hole, where speed and knowing the corners are the only advantages that exist. He goes forward with a lamp, or with no light at all, into a space the enemy dug and measured, and the enemy is waiting past the second turn with a short blade, at the height of a crawling man's throat. So, the Romans did not go down often, and when they did, it was into complexes they had already broken. What they did instead is what Dio says they did, and what the excavations imply. They found the air shafts. A hideout complex needs ventilation, and ventilation reaches the surface, and a surface opening can be located by a search party that knows what it is looking for. Then, it is simple. Post men on the exits, block or smoke the shafts. Fire and green material at a shaft mouth pushes smoke down into a sealed volume that people are breathing. Or do nothing at all. Sit on top of the complex with the food and the fields and wait, because the water in a cistern is finite and there is only one way to refill it, and it is above ground with a Roman sentry standing next to it. This is the same verdict this video has now delivered 5 times. Arbela, Gamla, Machaerus, Masada, and now 350 hiding places under the Judean hills. A refuge with one way in is a container, and the Roman army was the most patient organization in the ancient world. And there is one more piece of poetry in it. Bar Kokhba's men held Herodium, the artificial mountain Herod raised for himself south of Jerusalem, and they tunneled through it, cutting passages out of the underground water system and the substructures, punching new openings into the sides of a monument built by the king who created the very fortresses this country kept dying in. Herod's mountain, hollowed out by rebels, in the last war of the country he built. There is no turning point in the tunnel war, and that is precisely the point. Severus designed a campaign with no decisive moment in it, because a decisive moment is an opportunity for the enemy. What he built instead was a machine that removed one village a week for 4 years, and the horror of it is that at no point was there anything to fight. Before the ending, there is one cave that has to be opened, because it is the closest this entire story ever gets to the people in it. In the cliffs of Nahal Hever, a ravine running down to the Dead Sea, there are caves in a vertical face, reachable only by a path along a ledge. With Roman siege camps still visible on the cliff tops directly above them, refugees from the Fourth War went into them, and Roman troops sat on the rim and waited, and the people in the caves died there. In the 1960s, those caves were excavated, and what came out of them is the greatest documentary discovery of the Roman East. There was a bundle of 35 documents belonging to a woman named Babatha, daughter of Simeon, from a village on the southern shore of the Dead Sea. It is her entire legal life, kept together, carried up a cliff, and never retrieved. Deeds to date groves. Her marriage contracts, because she was widowed and married again. A registration of her land for the Roman census. Court summonses. A long-running dispute about the guardianship of her orphan son, in which she went repeatedly to the Roman courts and used Roman legal procedure and demanded a better allowance for the boy. She was not a queen or a rebel or a scholar. She was a landowning provincial widow in a difficult family situation, and she was fighting a very ordinary legal battle over money for a child, and she kept her paperwork in order. And then the war came over the hill, and she tied her documents into a bundle and climbed into a cave with them, along with her keys. Her keys. She locked her house before she left. In a neighboring cave, called the Cave of Horrors, excavators found the remains of men, women, and children who did not come out, with the Roman camp on the cliff above them. And in the same cliffs, in the same bundles, were the letters of Shimon ben Kokhba himself, not later copies. Dispatches, dictated by the commander of the revolt, sent to his district officers at Ein Gedi and elsewhere, and kept. They are not what the legend prepares you for. They are terse, practical, and irritable. He orders the requisition and immediate transport of palm branches and citrons and myrtle and willow, the 4 species needed for the festival of Sukkot, in the middle of a war of extermination. And he wants them sent up promptly, and he wants the tithe checked. He complains that his officers are sitting comfortably at Ein Gedi and eating and drinking from the property of the house of Israel while their brothers are in the field. He threatens a subordinate with being put in irons, and adds, more or less, that this is what he did to another man already. He invokes heaven as his witness. He asks about wheat. He gives instructions about a cow. That is the son of the star, a furious, exacting, hands-on quartermaster, running a supply crisis and a festival requisition at the same time, chasing his own officers over rations and rank, and utterly determined that the observance would happen on schedule while the empire was closing in. The legend built a Messiah. The documents give you a man, and the man is better because you can see him. What happened at Betar? By 135, the rebellion had been compressed into a single position. Betar is a ridge southwest of Jerusalem, a natural defensive site with steep slopes and a spur, fortified, and by the end it was full of refugees as well as fighters, and Shimon ben Kokhba was inside it. There is no narrative account of the Siege of Betar, and this needs to be said clearly. Dio gives it a sentence. The detailed stories come from rabbinic literature written down long afterwards, and they are literature. So the siege has to be reconstructed from the ground, and the ground is good, because the Roman works are still there. Surveys of the ridge have identified a Roman siege wall running around the site and camp remains beside it. And an inscription from the area records the presence of detachments of the 5th Legion Macedonica and the 11th Claudia. So we know the shape of it. Circumvallation, ceiling, sitting. And the decisive problem at Betar, as at Jotapata and Gamla, and everywhere else, is water. The springs that supplied the ridge lie outside the defensible perimeter, which means that once a continuous Roman wall is closed around the site, the clock starts, and it does not stop. Months of it, through the winter and into the summer. The Romans built and waited and shot, and the ridge filled with people who could not be fed, and eventually the wall was breached, and the place was stormed, and everybody in it was killed. Tradition places the fall on the 9th day of the month of Av. Flag that, gently but clearly. That is the same date on which tradition places the destruction of the first temple by Babylon and the destruction of the second temple by Rome. 3 catastrophes, 600 years apart, 5 centuries apart, 65 years apart, landing on the same square of the calendar. Anniversaries in ancient sources have a gravitational pull, and events migrate toward them in the retelling. It may be true. It is at least as likely to be the way memory files things. The Talmudic accounts of Betar are enormous, grief-stricken, and unusable as history, and they should be narrated as exactly what they are, which is a people's collective attempt to say something too large to be said in numbers. They say that blood ran from Betar to the sea, and that horses waded in it to their nostrils, and that the blood rolled boulders as it went. They say the Romans killed until their horses sank. They say that the dead of Betar were denied burial for years, and that when at last they were buried, the rabbis added a blessing to the daily prayer in gratitude. They also say that Betar fell because of a sin. In one version, Bar Kokhba was persuaded by a false report that the aged Rabbi Eleazar of Modian, who was fasting and praying inside the city, was negotiating with the Romans, and Bar Kokhba struck him and killed him. And a voice from heaven announced that the arm that had struck down the last defender of Israel would wither, and the city fell that day. That is not reportage. That is a moral judgment on a failed Messiah. delivered by a tradition that had decided, with hindsight, that the war should never have been fought. And they say that when the Romans found his body, a snake was coiled around his neck, and that the general said that if God had not killed this man, nobody could have. Even in defeat, even from a tradition that renamed him Son of the Lie, the legend cannot quite bring itself to let a Roman kill him. Then there is Dio's ledger, and it needs its own flags. He says 50 of the rebels' most important outposts and 985 of their most famous villages were razed, and that 580,000 men were killed in raids and battles, and that the number who died of hunger and disease and fire was beyond counting, so that nearly the whole of Judea was made desolate. He adds that wolves and hyenas came into the towns and howled, which is the standard ancient image for a country emptied of people. The numbers are the problem. 580,000 fighting men killed exceeds any plausible military-age population for that province, and Dio is writing a century later, through an abridger, and casualty figures in ancient sources inflate as a matter of routine. But the desolation itself is not rhetoric. Survey archaeology across the Judean lowlands shows exactly what Dio describes, a dense network of villages that were occupied before the war and abandoned after it, many never reoccupied, with the hideout complexes sealed underneath them. Whatever the true number was, an entire settled landscape stopped existing, and it can be walked over today. The reason Betar fell is the reason every fortress in this video fell. It was the last stronghold of a strategy that required strongholds to be impregnable, and it faced the one army in the world for which no stronghold ever was. How do you erase a country? Hadrian's settlement after 135 is unlike anything Rome did anywhere else, and it is the reason this episode exists. He did not simply garrison the province, he renamed it. The Provincia Judea, the administrative unit whose name derived from the people who lived in it, was merged with the northern territory and reissued as Syria Palaestina, reviving the old Greek geographical term derived from the Philistines, the coastal enemies of the ancient Israelites who had been gone for 600 years. Two readings of that act exist in the scholarship, and both deserve to be heard. The majority reading, and the older one, is that it was deliberate and punitive, an attempt to sever the connection between the land and the nation at the level of the map, and that reaching for the name of the ancient enemy was a calculated insult. The minority reading is that provincial renaming and merging happened for administrative reasons across the empire, that Syria Palaestina was a term already in geographic use since Herodotus, and that reading a Hadrianic vendetta into a boundary reform is hindsight. Weigh them yourself. What is not in dispute is the effect. The province lost the name of its people and never got it back under Rome. Jerusalem was completed as Aelia Capitolina, a Roman colony with a grid, a forum, temples, and no Jews. The sources indicate that Jews were forbidden to enter the territory of the city, with later testimony that they were permitted in only on one day a year to mourn, and modern scholars debate how consistently that was enforced across the following centuries. The 10th Legion stayed in it. The 6th stayed in the north. The captives went into the market. A tradition, from later sources and therefore flagged as such, holds that so many prisoners were sold at the terebinth market at Hebron and in Gaza that the price of a Jewish slave collapsed to the price of a horse. Jewish tradition records a persecution in the years immediately after the war, with the teaching of the law and public observance banned and leading scholars executed, including Rabbi Akiba, who is said to have been flayed with iron combs and to have died reciting the declaration of God's oneness. All of that comes from rabbinic literature, written down long afterwards, and belongs in the category of tradition, not documented event. The restrictions, whatever their extent, were relaxed under Hadrian's successor. And now the correction that matters most, because it is the single most widespread misunderstanding about this entire war. Rome did not expel the Jewish people from the land. There was no deportation order. There is no decree, no ancient source describing a general expulsion, and no logistical mechanism by which the empire could have removed an entire rural population and did not use on anybody else. What happened is grimmer and less dramatic. Enormous numbers were killed in the fighting and in the famine. Enormous numbers were enslaved and shipped. the Judean lowlands, were depopulated by war and never resettled. And Jews were barred from one city and its district. But Jewish life in the country did not end. It moved north. Galilee, which had been shattered in the First War and had stayed out of the Fourth, became the center. Within 2 generations, the rabbinic academies there had compiled the Mishnah, the foundation of the entire subsequent structure of Jewish law, and after that, the Jerusalem Talmud. Synagogues went up across Galilee in the following centuries, some of them large and elaborate and decorated, which is not what a suppressed and vanished community builds. The great diaspora communities of Babylonia and the West, which had existed for centuries before these wars, went on and in some cases flourished. So set the myth aside. The empire did not exile a nation. It destroyed a temple, depopulated a region, banned a people from a city, and renamed a province, and a religion that had already learned to survive without a building carried on in the hills to the north and across the sea. And the country recovered, which is the last correction. The picture of a wasteland with wolves howling in the streets applies to the Judean lowlands and not to the whole land. Galilee within a generation of 70 AD was prosperous, densely settled, and building. Caesarea and the coast thrived. The empire did what empires do, which is repopulate a tax base. Nobody salted anything, they just changed the name on the file. 4 conquests, 200 years. Why here? That is the question this whole video has been building toward, and there is no agreed answer, so here are the serious ones. The first explanation is structural and religious. On this reading, the collision was built into the situation from the day Pompey walked into the empty room. The Roman Empire ran on cult exchange. You worship your gods, we worship ours. Everyone honors the emperor's genius. Statues are set up, sacrifices are shared, and religion becomes the connective tissue of the empire, rather than a fault line in it. Judaism could not participate in that system without ceasing to be itself. One God, no image, one temple, one law. Rome accommodated this for a long time, with real ingenuity, through the sacrifice offered for the emperor rather than to him. But every accommodation was a special exception, and the exception depended on nobody testing it. Caligula tested it, Florus tested it, Hadrian tested it. On this reading, the war was always one bad governor away. The second explanation says the opposite, and it is associated with historians such as Martin Goodman. Nothing here was inevitable. Judea was governed badly by a run of second-rate officials. The local ruling class lost its ability to mediate between the population and Rome. And in 66, a chain of accidents that nobody intended produced a rebellion nobody had planned. Steve Mason's reading of the outbreak fits alongside this, as an escalation of local incidents rather than the execution of an ideology. And then, crucially, Goodman argues that what turned a suppressed revolt into a permanent condition was Roman domestic politics. Vespasian was an emperor with no ancestry and no legitimacy, who had taken the throne in a civil war, and he needed a foreign triumph. So a provincial insurgency was dramatized into a great national conquest with a triumph, an arch, a coin series, a punitive tax on every Jew in the empire, and a permanent occupation. On this reading, Rome could have reconciled with Judea after 70 and chose not to because the new dynasty's legitimacy was built out of the wreckage, and the Flavian propaganda machine manufactured the conditions for the Fourth War. The third explanation looks at the war from below, and it is associated with historians such as Richard Horsley. On this reading, the fundamental conflict was not between Judeans and Romans, but inside Judean society over land, debt, and the collapsing legitimacy of an aristocracy that had made itself the tax collector for an empire. Look at the evidence. In the first week of the revolt in 66, the rebels burned the public archive, and Josephus says explicitly that they did it to destroy the debt records. Simon Bar Giora built his army by freeing slaves. The factions in Jerusalem killed the aristocracy in far greater numbers than the Romans did, and did it before Titus arrived. On this reading, the Great Revolt was a social revolution wearing the clothes of a war of independence, which is one reason it was so incapable of producing a unified command. And the fourth, is the accelerant that made all of the above lethal. Judea in this period had a live apocalyptic tradition, and apocalyptic movements do not calculate odds, because the odds are not the relevant variable when the age is ending. You can trace it from Judas the Galilean's fourth philosophy through the desert prophets who led crowds out to the Jordan expecting a sign, to the prophet who put 6,000 people on the burning portico, to the coins reading redemption, to Akiba applying the star prophecy to a guerrilla commander. Agrippa's speech was a superb strategic analysis, and it was answered with stones, because he was arguing about the balance of forces to people who had concluded that the balance of forces was not what the fight was about. Those are lenses, not verdicts, and the best history of this war uses several of them at once. A structurally impossible religious accommodation, administered incompetently, in a society with a class war running underneath it, in a generation that believed the age was ending, against an empire that needed a spectacular victory more than it needed a quiet province. So count them again. 63 BC, 37 BC, 70 AD, 135 AD. 4 times, Rome conquered this country. It won every single war. It never lost a campaign here, not once, in 2 centuries. And look at what winning cost. A legion's eagle lost in a mountain pass, a governor's army destroyed on the road, a legion possibly erased from the army lists and never spoken of again. The best general in the empire summoned from Britain to the Dead Sea, 2 legions permanently garrisoned in a province the size of a large county, and an emperor who could not tell his own senate that his armies were well. Here is the thing Rome never understood. Rome's problem was never taking Judea. Rome took Judea whenever it wanted to. The problem was that in this one province, every instrument of Roman success was also an instrument of the next revolt. The client king created a dynasty nobody accepted. The procurator created grievance. The triumph created humiliation. The tax created a permanent annual reminder. The colony on the ruins created the Fourth War. Everything that worked everywhere else in the empire, here, loaded the spring again. Hadrian ended the cycle, and the only way he could end it was to stop playing. He did not just defeat the rebellion. He removed the city, removed the name, and removed the province from the map as a thing that could be fought over. And even that did not work the way he intended, because the thing Rome had actually been fighting was never on the map. It was a religion that had learned, in the ruins of 70, to exist without a building, and no siege engine ever devised can breach a text. Within 300 years, a movement that began in this same small province, under these same procurators, in these same decades, was sitting on the throne of the empire, and a Roman emperor was bowing to a god first worshipped in Judea. Watch the map one last time. Watch the name Judea fade off the province, and Syria, Palaestina, come up in its place. No other province ever demanded 4 conquests, and no other province ever changed Rome more. If 200 years of war were worth a couple of hours of your life, hit that like button, get hyped in the comments, and subscribe so that more history at this length keeps finding you. And before you go, settle the argument this whole story has been asking. Why could Rome never hold Judea in peace? Was it the governors, who bled the province and provoked what they could not control? Was it a collision between an empire of many gods and a people of one that no amount of good administration could have solved? Was it a class war that spiraled outward until it looked like a national one? Or was it a chain of accidents that nobody wanted and nobody knew how to stop? Pick one. Defend it below, and tell me why the other 3 are wrong.